Chapter 551. Ji-jin came from Scholatry Manor in the south. He had sworn a blood oath to become a monolith guardian that he could never leave the mausoleum of books for the rest of his life. Last year, this person had attempted to help the Scholatry Manor disciple Zhong Hui surpass Chen Chongxing and Go Hanshi in comprehending the monolith. He had ridiculed and reprimanded Chen Chongxing and Go Hanshi's method of comprehending the monoliths, but in the end, he had been silently humiliated by Chen Chongxing and Go Hanshi. Ji-jin stared at Chen Chongxing, his eyes filled with hostility and resentment. Although as a monolith guardian, he could never leave the mausoleum of books, he was not cut off from the world. News from outside the mausoleum of books gradually reached his ears. Chen Chongxing had comprehended the entire front mausoleum in a single day. He had become the youngest principal of the Orthodox Academy. He had gone to the Garden of Zhou. He might have died, but he had come back to life. He had journeyed south with Su Li. His cultivation of the sword had advanced by leaps and bounds, breaking into star condensation and defeating the proud son of heaven, Su Yorong, on the bridge of helplessness. He had finally been confirmed as the successor to the orthodoxy. The disciple from Scholatry Manor, Zhong Hui, whom he had placed high hopes on, had obtained third place upon the first banner in the previous year's grand examination, below Chen Chongxing and Go Hanshi. In the short span of a year, he had obtained an enormous improvement, shocking the entire South. But how could he compare to Chen Chongxing? Crucially, this was the mausoleum of books that he had willingly offered up his life and freedom for. Just what right do you have to come and go as you please? Su Yorong did not recognize Ji-jin, but she could sense that this monolith guardian with such a profound cultivation clearly held hostility towards Chen Chongxing. Chen Chongxing roughly understood where Ji-jin's anger came from. He slightly bowed but said nothing. Logically speaking, it should have been Ji-jin bowing to him, but he thought that Ji-jin's age and seniority were both here, so he bowed first. Yet Ji-jin still had no intention of bowing to him. He only stared at him. Su Yorong's expression was very calm, but her eyes gradually brightened as she looked at Ji-jin. Chen Chongxing shook his head and brought her along the other side of the mountain path. Ji-jin's hands, which were exposed outside of his sleeves, were slightly trembling. Especially when Chen Chongxing and Su Yorong brushed past him, his veins popped out. In the end, he did nothing because he did not dare. These years, he had been very depressed. He really wanted to vent, and Chen Chongxing was naturally the best target. But while he was in the mausoleum of books, his family and Scholatry Manor were still outside. If he did not want his family and Scholatry Manor to be burned to ashes by the furious flames of the orthodoxy, then there was nothing he could do. He didn't have to bow to Chen Chongxing, but he couldn't attack Chen Chongxing. The sun gradually rose, and the snowy clouds dispersed. The capital in winter had a different kind of beauty, with a sense of spaciousness. Standing next to the forest in the middle of the mausoleum and looking at the distant streets of the capital, Chen Chongxing remembered the time when he and Luo Luo stood on the banyan tree and looked at the streets in the Tradition Academy. He said, "I once asked Luo Luo to help me investigate information about you. Since, now that I've found you, I feel that I should tell her about this, so I mentioned it to her in the letter." Su Yorong softly said, "Back in Mountley, when I first thought you were dead, I told Senior about what happened in the Garden of Zhou. Senior was a little worried about me, so after eating beef ribs a few days ago, I wrote a letter to him. They had met on the Bridge of Helplessness that day, and then they ate beef ribs in a pot. They had confirmed a few things, so they felt that they should confirm a few other things. This was a very responsible attitude. Although they had no experience in this aspect, nor did they think too much about the specifics, they still did this. Mentioning these two letters at this time was naturally another way to express his sincerity. From the Garden of Zhou until now, they had expressed their feelings many times, but those methods were rather special, like brushing the snow, touching their shoulders, or writing letters to others. Chen Chongqing's eyes were very clear, like a small stream. It was very easy to see those happy expressions that swam like fish. Su Yorong softly said, "I had you come to the mausoleum of books not for, but for proper business." Her words had an unexpressed meaning. The "not for" in her words actually meant that it was not just for this meeting in the mausoleum of books. What proper business could there be? Naturally, it was the matter of the heavenly tome monolith. Behind them was the reflecting monolith hut. On the black monolith, those poems were so clear, but those lines were still so difficult to understand. Chen Chongqing walked up to the monolith hut and thought back to the time he had spent viewing the monoliths last year. At that time, I was cooking in the grass hut, and I saw the light fall on the fence. He recounted his experiences of viewing the monoliths and comprehending the Tao, as well as several methods, without holding anything back. Su Yorong quietly listened, her hands behind her gently trembling in the cool breeze, as if she was pushing the faded star plate, incessantly deducing according to his words. When Chen Chongqing finished, she began to recount her first experience of viewing the reflecting monolith and what she had learned. So in essence, the so-called thickness is also a change in the light. Chen Chongqing was somewhat uncertain. The brushstrokes of the rubbings have always been different. Won't the meaning be lost because of the shape? Su Yorong replied, "The rubbings of the heavenly tome monoliths preserved by South Stream Temple were made by the first holy maiden using the heart of the heavens to imprint it on her soul. Then she turned it over to the monoliths, and only 2 or 3 of its true meaning remained." Hearing this, Chen Chongqing could not help but feel a boundless reverence towards the holy maiden who had founded the southern faction of the orthodoxy. 2 or 3 true meanings could be stored. This sounded like a rather wretched ratio, but it must be known that the true meanings here were the true meanings of the heavenly tome monolith. That first holy maiden had actually been able to directly imprint those true meanings into her soul, and even reconstruct them into lines and shape. This could truly be considered a great divine ability. These kinds of rubbings of the heavenly tome monoliths were naturally completely different from the rubbings sold by the peddlers in front of the Plum Garden Inn. "And I wasn't talking about rubbings just now," Su Yorong said. "The thickness I was talking about was the thickness of the brush strokes on the heavenly tome monoliths." Chen Chongqing did not quite understand. He asked, "You've come to the mausoleum of books to view the monoliths?" Su Yorong was somewhat embarrassed. "When I was 5, the Empress carried me here." Chen Chongqing was silent. He thought to himself, she really is a person that makes people speechless. After viewing the reflecting monolith, they went to the second heavenly tome monolith. Occasionally, they would see a few monolith viewers, but there were not many of them. Moreover, those people had remained in the mausoleum of books for many years, and their Tao hearts had long since become silent. Their attention was only on the monoliths, and they did not notice their arrival. The two casually strolled through the mausoleum, exchanging their experiences and comprehensions from viewing the monolith. Comparing their experiences with each other, they each benefited from it. By the time they arrived in front of the broken monolith, the winter sun had already reached its zenith. There was not a single person in front of the monolith hut. Chen Chongqing walked into the hut and looked at the broken monolith in silence. Su Yorong walked to his side, looked at him, and shook her head. In a soft but firm voice, she said, "Don't. For the sake of thanking a certain reader, and also because I can't stand the loneliness, I can't keep the sesame oil, and I can't keep the manuscript. There's a chapter at 8 in the evening." Chapter 552. Don't do what? Chen Chongqing naturally understood. After a moment of silence, he nodded. This broken monolith had been severed by Zhou Dufu. The heavenly tome monolith that had originally been here had been taken away by him, probably placed in the garden of Zhou. This also meant that it was extremely likely that the heavenly tome monolith was currently on his and Su Yorong's bodies. The moment he saw the broken monolith, He felt an intense desire to see the complete heavenly tome monolith. He wanted to test which of the two beads was the heavenly tome monolith, and then reattach it. Su Yorong did not let him do this, because she was keenly aware that the return of the heavenly tome monoliths to the old mausoleum would definitely cause the heavens and earth to change color, and all the experts of the world would sense it. There are a total of 11 heavenly tome monoliths in the outside world. He looked at the peak of the mausoleum of books and whispered, "If the front mausoleum is divided by the broken monolith, doesn't that mean that this place is divided into 12 mausoleums?" The mausoleum of books was a very mysterious place. The peak seemed to be very close, yet so far that it seemed to touch the sky. Chen Chongsheng and Su Yorong both knew that before Zhou Dufu seized these heavenly tome monoliths, the mausoleum of books did not actually have a front mausoleum. Su Yorong said, "You can ask someone about these things." Chen Chongsheng was slightly surprised and said, "Ask who?" "I asked her ladyship, but she refused to tell me." Su Yorong gazed at a certain place below the mausoleum of books. "But there are definitely others who know." Chen Chongsheng asked, "When do we start?" Su Yorong lifted the front of her robe and sat cross-legged in front of the monolith hut. She then extended her hand and invited him to sit on the grass to her right. Her slender fingers, separated by a distance of several feet, fell on the remnants of the broken monolith. Her brush moved like the wind, turning into words one after another. She wrote very quickly, but there was absolutely no break between her strokes. It was extremely clear, just like the sword that had broken through the wind and snow on the bridge of helplessness. Even a saint who had stepped into the divine domain would probably only be able to faintly catch a trace or two of the marks left behind by her fingers, unable to see them clearly. The only one who could see those words clearly was Chen Chongsheng, who was sitting beside her on the grass. After she finished writing, it was Chen Chongsheng's turn. His fingers were extremely steady, each stroke was like a chisel. The finger pierced through the air, bringing with it the wind. After the wind dispersed, the traces would naturally disappear. As for the broken tablet, it was even more impossible for anything to be left behind. Chen Chongsheng and Su Yorong, on the other hand, were very focused and serious as they looked at the broken monolith. That was because they had memorized all the words that had just been written. The handwriting was both words and pictures. The having saber art was divided into 3 parts, 108 moves. Back in the Garden of Zhou, when the Black Nightmare coffin had been opened, they had discovered the world's most famous and most powerful blade style. The blade technique left behind by Zhou Dufu was extremely mystical. The 108 blades seemed to be individual blade techniques, but in reality they were a whole. Only by completely grasping all 108 blades could one truly understand the true meaning of the having blade technique. At that time, Su Yorong had brought the monster tide to attack. They did not have enough time, so they could only split up and memorize it. Su Yorong memorized it from the front, memorizing 37 moves, while Chen Chongsheng memorized it from the back, memorizing 69 moves. Afterwards, just as their shoulders met and they smiled at each other, the having blade style on the coffin wall disappeared without a trace. What did this mean? It meant that only the two of them could make the having blade style reappear in the world. After leaving the Garden of Zhou, they had both attempted to copy down these blade styles, but to their shock, they discovered that when Zhou Dufu had carved the blade style on the coffin wall, it actually contained some of the mysteries of the heavenly tome monolith. With their current level of cultivation, it was simply impossible for them to reproduce those lines in their sea of consciousness on paper. What did this mean? It meant that only when the two of them were together could they practice the having blade style. Back in the mausoleum of Zhou, Chen Chongsheng had said, "Let us practice together." Now it seemed that this sentence was truly an incomparably accurate prophecy. After a very, very long time they had finally reunited. They finally had the chance to practice this blade style together. The broken monolith under the hut had been cut in half by Zhou Dufu using the having blade. Although it had been battered by wind and rain for hundreds or even thousands of years, it still retained some of its blade intent. In front of the broken monolith, a peerless divine technique like the having blade style reappeared. Comprehending it and then cultivating it, there was nothing more perfect than this. They had obviously entered the mausoleum of books for proper business. Time slowly passed. The winter sun slowly moved. The area in front of the broken monolith hut was quiet. On the high platform that connected to the sky, under the sky that was divided by the courtyard, in front of the clear canal, several pairs of eyes fell upon this place. The young man and woman, shoulder to shoulder, quietly sat in the grass. From anyone's point of view, this was clearly a romance. Who could have imagined that they were learning the blade, cultivating the Tao? Of course, learning the blade and cultivating the Tao could also be the method they were using to talk about love. The 10 heavenly tome monoliths, the secret of the Garden of Zhou, the confrontation between the two factions. There were far too many reasons for Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong to be wary and worried about each other. Let alone love, in the long river of history, father and son killing each other, husband and wife falling out, had already happened far too many times. Those people were all truly powerful figures, all of them possessing discerning eyes that could see through the mortal world. But in the end they had still sunk into the quagmire of mutual harm. Why? Because those benefits had already surpassed the limits of the mortal world. Fortunately, the 10 heavenly tome monoliths, the secret of the Garden of Zhou, the peerless divine technique that could only be cultivated together, there were far too many similar or different reasons that made it seem as if they were destined to be inseparable in this life. Viewing the heavenly tome monoliths, comprehending the having blade, reading the scroll of time, thinking about how to break the array left behind by Wang Zhizi, time passed very quickly. The appointment in the mausoleum of books had ended, and the two of them had gained a deeper understanding of the heavenly tome. They had finally turned the having blade into true knowledge. Although they had not completely grasped the scroll of time, they had spent a beautiful period of time together. They left the broken monolith hut, but did not directly leave the mausoleum. Instead, they followed the path at the foot of the mausoleum, heading south to the shallow canal. The shallow and clear canal passed through the stone plain, forming an extremely complex diagram. Above them, at the foot of the mountain, was an extremely simple mountain path. The mountain path was extremely straight, leading from the foot of the mountain to the highest peak. The stone steps were made of white stone. This was the legendary divine path. Chen Chongqing was not unfamiliar with this scenery and diagram. Back then, on the first day he had entered the mausoleum, he had come here. On that night, he and his companions had seen Sun Mei wake up from his dream of the mausoleum. He had left the small courtyard and come here. He had stepped over the shallow waters of the canal, crushed the traces of stars in the water, and walked towards the pavilion. He wanted to use this divine path to reach the peak of the mausoleum. Then, he had fallen into Chen Chongqing's bosom. Sun Mei's resolute advance towards the divine path had left him, Go Hanshi, and the others, with a mental impact that was difficult to erase. It was even more important than the notebook he had left behind for them. Looking at the perfectly straight divine path between the cliffs and the seemingly incomparably distant peak that seemed to touch the vault of heaven, Chen Chongqing was silent. He thought that there would be a day when he would walk up from here. If he wanted to walk up the divine path, he needed to pass through the pavilion. Under the pavilion was a person. His entire body was covered in heavy and old-fashioned armor. Even his face and hands were covered in rusted metal. He looked like a statue, but he did not give off a deathly stillness. He only gave off an incomparably ancient feeling. When I first came up with the name of the chapter, I almost wrote that word. TSK. Luckily I realized it quickly. Chapter 553. A few days ago, Su Yorong had said that if he wanted to know the situation in the mausoleum of books, he could ask someone. Even if the Divine Empress did not say it, there would definitely be people who knew. Since it was a matter of the mausoleum of books, who in the world could understand it better than this person? This person had already sat in the mausoleum of books for several hundred years. She and Chen Chongqing walked across the clear water and arrived in front of the pavilion. She bowed to the person under the pavilion. There were already very few people in the world who were qualified for her and Chen Chongqing to bow at the same time, but the person under the pavilion was different. The continent's #1 divine general, Han Qing, had an extremely high seniority, was the oldest, and had an extremely profound cultivation. Many years ago, he had already approached the divine domain and could be called invincible on the battlefield. He was the only person in the present world that could compare to those legendary divine generals of the past. People like Su Shiji and Shui, he simply could not compare, and not even the current storms of the 8 directions dared to say that they could definitely defeat him. What made people sigh in awe was that this person had guarded the mausoleum of books for several hundred years and had never left. It was as if he wanted to sit here until the end of his life. "Hello, I am Su Yurong. I have come under the orders of my master to ask Senior a few questions." Su Yurong looked at the man in the armor and said softly. Due to being covered, there was no way to confirm whether the man within the armor had opened his eyes or not, but Chen Chongqing could clearly see that some dust suddenly flew out from the cracks of the armor, like tiny moths dancing under the sunlight. At the same time, he could clearly feel a pair of eyes that were like iron spears falling upon him and Su Yurong. "Who is your teacher?" An old voice came from the depths of the armor. It seemed to be covered in rust, and seemed to have experienced the vicissitudes of life. Su Yurong replied, "I come from South Stream Temple." South Stream Temple was divided into the outer sect and the inner sect, but only the current holy maiden or a direct descendant could walk in the name of South Stream Temple. The light of the winter sun fell on the surface of the armor, but it did not add warmth. Instead, it seemed even colder, just like the voice that came from the armor. "Why didn't she come herself?" My master said that her question was something that Senior couldn't answer back then, and she still can't answer it now, so she left this opportunity to me. "Go ahead." Just how many heavenly tome monoliths were stolen from the mausoleum of books? Su Yurong's gaze fell on the divine general's armor through the flying dust and the winter sunlight. She was very calm and gentle. But her question was so direct and biting cold, as if the divine path at the southern foot of the mausoleum of books wanted to pierce through the heavens. Chen Chongqing glanced at her and thought, Divine General Han Qing has guarded the mausoleum of books for several hundred years, guarding the divine path and secrets of the mausoleum of books. There are many heavenly tome monoliths that are not in the mausoleum of books, but have been lost outside. This is without a doubt the mausoleum of books' greatest secret, so how could he answer you? Unexpectedly, in the next moment, the old and cold voice came from the armor. 12. Upon hearing this answer, Chen Chongqing was slightly shocked. Firstly, Divine General Han Qing was actually willing to answer this question, and secondly, the answer itself. He and Su Yurong glanced at each other, and saw the astonishment in each other's eyes. There were 12 heavenly tome monoliths wandering about outside? All of them were taken by that person? Su Yurong continued to ask as she looked at the person under the pavilion. 11. What about the other one? Emperor Taizu took it away. Upon hearing this, Chen Chongqing thought of the notebook that Wang Jitze had hidden in the pavilion of ascending mist. In the notebook, Wang Jitze had once mentioned that in his later years, Taizu had been imprisoned in the palace and indulged in sensual pleasures. In the end, he had given Chen Chongqing an item. Zhou Dufu took away the heavenly tome monoliths, so that's why the front mausoleum exists? Correct, so the current mausoleum of books is actually 13 mausoleums. A broken monolith was a boundary monolith, so 12 monoliths were naturally 13 mausoleums. This was not a particularly difficult problem to calculate. Note, those heavenly tome monoliths, where are they now? Su Yorong finally asked the most crucial question. Before coming to the pavilion on the divine path, she and Chen Chongqing had both believed that all the heavenly tome monoliths were in their hands, but now it seemed that this was not the case. No one knows where the heavenly tome monoliths that person took away are. Upon hearing the voice from the armor, Chen Chongqing lowered his head in silence. He thought to himself, I know. But there is one heavenly tome monolith that should be in the demon lord's hands. Upon hearing this, Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong were finally shocked. The mountain mausoleum was silent. The clear and shallow water in the canals slowly flowed without any sound. Just what use did they have in taking away those heavenly tome monoliths? First of all, this has already exceeded the scope of what I originally promised South Stream Temple. Secondly, if I knew, would I have needed to sit here for several hundred years? After saying this, there was no more sound. The winter wind whistled through the pavilion, carrying with it the dust on the armor and ruffling the cold light. The divine general seemed to have once again become a statue. Leaving the pavilion and returning to Sun Mei's small courtyard, Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong looked at the plum blossoms outside the fence in silence for a while. At the very beginning, there were 11 heavenly tome monoliths around the mausoleum of Zhou. If the heavenly tome monolith that Wang Jitze obtained from Emperor Taizu was not originally there, then it also means that we guessed wrong from the very beginning. The person who entered the garden of Zhou and took away that heavenly tome monolith, forcing Zhou Dufu to use 10,000 swords to suppress it, was not Wang Jitze, but the demon lord. That heavenly tome monolith is currently in the demon lord's hands, and there are still 11 in our hands. Su Yorong turned around and softly said to him, There's no need to worry too much. Besides Chen Chongqing, in this world, only she had personally seen the 10 heavenly tome monoliths around the mausoleum of Zhou, as well as the black stone that Chen Chongqing had taken out of his sheath. Since the garden of Zhou had reopened, Chen Chongqing should have had 11 heavenly tome monoliths in his hands, but on that night by the window of the imperial palace, he had taken out 10. Su Yorong had never asked him where the other heavenly tome monolith was. She had a rough guess, and even if they split it equally according to Chen Chongqing's suggestion, they should have had 10. That black stone that Emperor Taizu had secretly given to Wang Jitze and then passed on to Chen Chongqing had originally been brought into the garden of Zhou by him, so it was his own. I've never worried about getting lost in a world that I don't have the ability to enter. Chen Chongqing looked at her and said, I'm just worried that you might bear some unnecessary pressure because of me. This was a problem that they had never discussed. Su Yorong was the current holy maiden of the South. Ever since she was a child, she had been regarded as the future leader of the human world. From the moment she was born, she was used to living with a sense of responsibility. Back then in the snowy temple of the plains of the unsetting sun, she had once said to him that this sort of life truly was rather tiring, but she was already used to it. The reappearance of the heavenly tome monoliths was an extremely important matter to the human world. It could even affect the comparison of strength between the humans and demons. With her Tao heart that embraced the world, if this matter were not related to Chen Chongqing, she would probably have already announced it to the world and then returned the heavenly tome monoliths to the mausoleum of books. On that snowy night, when Chen Chongqing placed the 5 stone pearls in her hands, he finally thought of this problem. He did not want her to bear this sort of pressure. Note: in truth, in order to gather enough for the 13 mausoleums, I still very seriously checked and calculated. Then I'll see you at 8. I'm really prepared to use up all my manuscripts at any moment. Chapter 554. I will learn to treat these stone pearls as beautiful ornaments, and not as heavenly tome monoliths. Su Yorong looked at him and calmly said, And then, I'm a little hungry. Sun Mei's grass hut had been uninhabited for a very long time. It was very dusty, but all sorts of utensils were still present. Chen Chongqing went to the garden and picked 2 handfuls of vegetables, a dozen or so peppers, and cut up half of a piece of cured meat. He covered it in honey and steamed it. Together with white rice, it was a fragrant and sweet meal. Su Yorong was very satisfied with the meal, but she was a little embarrassed. Afterwards, they discussed the grand examination and next year's boiling stone summit, as well as how to leave the mausoleum of books. In order to prevent others from seeing them and guessing what was going on, which would make the rumors in the capital even more fervent, the two decided to leave separately. Su Yorong would leave first, while Chen Chongqing would stay in the mausoleum of books for another day. However, they did not think that this was a complete cover-up. How could it be hidden from others? In other words, this was called deceiving oneself while stealing a bell. However, before Su Yorong had time to leave, the small courtyard welcomed an uninvited guest. The guest was the monolith guardian from Scholartree Manor, Ji Jin. Perhaps because he recognized Su Yorong's identity, or perhaps because he had guessed at something, he stood by the fence. His expression was somewhat lonely, his face somewhat pale, and the resentment and unwillingness in his eyes had disappeared. It was very complicated but indescribable. Chen Chongqing prepared to say something, but Su Yorong indicated for him to wait a moment. Her sleeves fluttered as she walked to the fence. She looked at Ji Jin with an indifferent expression and said, "I will request that your qualifications as a monolith guardian be revoked and that you be expelled from the mausoleum of books." Sunlight seeped through the branches of the plum trees in the orange grove and fell on her face. That extremely beautiful face immediately added a sense of holiness and solemnity. Because when she said those words, she was the aloof holy maiden of the South. To become a monolith guardian of the mausoleum of books was an extremely difficult task. One needed to make an extremely extreme blood oath, one that seemed to contain the power of the heavenly Tao. Once they swore a blood oath and became a monolith guardian, they would obtain the freedom that cultivators yearned for day and night, the freedom to interact with the heavenly tome monolith. At the same time, they would also lose the freedom to leave the mausoleum of books. For the rest of their lives, they could only study the heavenly tome monoliths in the mausoleum of books and study. They could not take a step out of the mausoleum of books. Countless years had passed since the orthodoxy had set down this rule, but there had only been one exception. That was when Su Li had charged into the mausoleum of books, berated the two monolith guardians from the Mount Li sword sect, and then forcefully brought them back to Mount Li. Those two monolith guardians were the two elders of Mount Li's discipline hall, and they were also one of the main reasons for Mount Li's internal strife. The allure of the mausoleum of books to cultivators was far too great. It was like a beautiful dream that could not be ended. The more profound one's Tao was, the longer one studied the heavenly tome monoliths, the more reluctant one was to leave. Even Sun Mei, who was a great cultivator with extraordinary talent, needed several tens of years to wake up. To cancel the blood oath of a monolith guardian and expel him from the mausoleum of books, only the Pope and the Holy Maiden had the right to do so. Moreover, the monolith guardian would suffer the backlash of the blood oath, which would be extremely painful. Hearing Su Yorong's words and seeing Ji Jin's face instantly pale and his body incessantly trembling, Chen Chongqing grew wary. In his view, Ji Jin had suffered such humiliation and such a heavy punishment. He would assuredly be enraged to the extreme, perhaps even go crazy and attack Su Yorong. However, Ji Jin did not attack in rage. After a while, he gradually calmed down and bowed to Su Yorong through the fence. He clasped his hands to the ground, appearing incomparably respectful. His voice was somewhat trembling, very excited, and also somewhat perplexed. "Many thanks for the Holy Maiden's pity. Ji Jin is endlessly grateful and will definitely repay it with his life." Seeing Ji Jin's figure gradually vanish into the forest, Chen Chongqing was somewhat confused. "Why?" "Because he wants to leave. I hear the backlash of the blood oath is very frightening. In the end, it's even more frightening than not having freedom." "But, didn't they become monolith guardians of their own volition? As time passes, A person's thoughts will often undergo changes that they would have never imagined at the beginning. Su Yorong walked up to his side and said, "To many cultivators, the mausoleum of books is the most beautiful dream, and also the longest imprisonment." Chen Chongqing faintly remembered that he had once heard a similar saying. She continued, "In truth, I had this idea a long time ago. I was prepared to persuade the martial uncles of the temple to discuss with the Li Palace and change this rule." Chen Chongqing gazed at her incomparably elegant face and felt that she was becoming more and more beautiful. He sincerely said, "You are a good person." Then he added, "If the Li Palace does not agree to South Stream Temple's request, once I become pope, I will also strive to abolish this rule." Su Yorong softly said, "You are also a good person." On the next day, Chen Chongqing left the mausoleum of books. Under the escort of several cardinals, he returned to the Orthodox Academy. At this time, the morning light was bright and the western sky was as dark as night. It was still very early. He was preparing to go across the lake to the newly repaired kitchen to find Xian Yuanpe for some food, but he suddenly saw a completely unexpected person on the great banyan tree. He couldn't help but ask in surprise, "What happened?" Apart from a few special circumstances, Tang 36 would never get up so early, but at this time, he was standing on the arm of the great banyan tree, gazing into the distance. Whether it was because he hadn't slept all night or something else, he didn't look at Chen Chongqing. He continued gazing into the distance, his expression indifferent as he asked, "Do you know what the most painful thing in the world is?" Chen Chongqing shook his head. Tang 36 sneered, "The most painful thing in the world is when all of us are as tired as pigs and dogs, yet some people still have the leisure to go on dates. Moreover, you have to keep a certain person's secret. Not bad to actually have a rendezvous in the mausoleum of books." After the Orthodox Academy accepted new students, the first test the new students faced was the grand examination. For the sake of the upcoming grand examination, both Tang 36 and Su Mo Yu were extremely busy. Even Zhixio would occasionally give lessons to the students, using pain and blood to teach them what true battle was. Yet Chen Chongqing, as the principal of the Orthodox Academy, paid no attention to this matter. Tang 36's true pain still had to be related to keeping a secret. Chen Chongqing and Su Yurong had gotten to know each other in the garden of Zhou. They had feelings for each other and would often meet in private. This secret was something that only he knew of in the capital. Once a secret was known, the person with the secret would often become much more relaxed, just like Chen Chongqing and Su Yurong in the past few days. But the person who knew the secret but could not speak of it to others would inherit their pain and pressure, perhaps even a little more. Rumors spread throughout the capital. Everyone said that Chen Chongqing was bitterly in love with Su Yurong but could not. Tang 36 wanted nothing more than to spit on those people's faces. He wanted nothing more than to reopen Clear Lake Restaurant and stand on the roof to tell this story to the tens of thousands of people, to announce the secret of those two to the world. But he could not do this, so he was in great pain, even somewhat angry. Chen Chongqing looked at him and said in confusion, "Back then, it was you who said that I had to endure it." Tang 36 looked at him and said, "But I'm almost unable to endure it anymore." Chapter 555. The grand examination arrived as scheduled. It was still at the Li Palace. Outside the Li Palace, there was still a sea of people. The various gambling dens had long since made their preparations, storytellers using their best Maojian tea to rinse their mouth. But there were still some differences, such as the expressions and gazes of the spectating crowd. They were no longer as passionate and excited as they were last year. Many people were constantly yawning, and the number of tourists that had hurried over from other provinces was clearly much lower than last year. The reason for this was that last year's grand examination was a great year. Many of the young geniuses that ranked high on the proclamation of Azure Clouds had come to participate. Compared to last year, this year's grand examination was truly lacking in anything noteworthy. There were not many famous figures, and Su Yu-rong, who had once been the object of many people's hopes, had lost all hope following her succession as Holy Maiden. In reality, both Chiu Shan-jun and Su Yu-rong could no longer participate in the grand examination. They had never needed the grand examination to affirm themselves, and those that had the qualifications to compete with them on equal footing had already arrived last year, such as Chen Chongsheng. Of course, Chen Chongsheng had still come to the Li Palace, drawing the enthusiastic cheers of the populace, as well as the discussions that had not abated in the past few days. Could little Principal Chen really be a descendant of the imperial clan? Could he really be Crown Prince Xiaoming? Fine, this theory was too absurd. Then was he really trying to renew the engagement? Was it true that he had waited outside the Holy Maiden's Hall for an entire night? Wasn't the snow that night very heavy? Tang 36 and Su Mo Yu brought the 3 new students that had barely passed the preparatory examination into the Li Palace examination grounds. Chen Chongsheng, on the other hand, was led by a cardinal into the depths of the Li Palace. It wasn't that he was unwilling to shoulder the responsibility of principal, but it was truly the first year that Orthodox Academy was recruiting new students. The foundations of the new students were truly too poor. Being able to pass the preparatory examination was already a pleasant surprise, but it was impossible to place too much hope on their performance in the grand examination. In addition, Li Palace was essentially Orthodox Academy's home ground, so he did not need to worry about encountering the same problem as last year. He had more important things to do. Seeing the seemingly endless stream of water pouring into the green leaf from the wooden ladle, he once again began to ponder the question he had in the past. The green leaf world was the same as the Garden of Zhou. Since it could not grow larger, why did it need to be so meticulously cared for, to allow it to continuously grow? The Pope put down the wooden ladle, took a soft towel, and wiped the beads of water on his hands. He indicated that he should sit down and said, "There are some rules that are truly too old-fashioned and need to be changed, but you must also understand that without rules, nothing can be accomplished. Living under the starry sky, how can one not need reverence? If we all live like Su Li, we will naturally be happy, but don't forget that while rules are restraints for the strong, they are sometimes a form of protection for the weak. We need to consider how the world operates and not our own thoughts." Previously, when Chen Chongsheng had raised the question of the Black Dragon and the Monolith Guardian, the Pope had given a clear answer to the latter question, but he had not mentioned a single word about the former. His stance was already very clear. "Martial uncle, your view of the world is different from the Divine Empress's, resulting in these problems? You can take it that way." But Chen Chongsheng still wanted to argue. The Pope raised his hand to indicate that there was no need for him to speak further. Looking at him, he said, "Even if you want to put your view of the world into practice, there is no need to be in such a hurry." Chen Chongsheng thought of that shadow that lay before him and thought to himself that he had no choice but to be in a hurry. "Once you become Pope, you can do whatever you want. When that time comes, you don't need to ask me." "Martial uncle, after hearing these words, do you really want me to be like Mei Li Sha and die early?" The Pope looked at him and said with a smile. Chen Chongsheng had no idea how to respond to these words. "Don't worry, it won't be long." The Pope walked to the side of the potted plant and used a handkerchief to carefully wipe away the water droplets on the green leaf. Chen Chongsheng didn't receive any good news from that secluded palace, but not long after he left, he heard an unexpected piece of good news. The grand examination had officially ended. The good news had arrived: 2 students from Orthodox Academy had actually entered the 3 grades. That Chu Wenbin, who had transferred from Heavenly Academy, had even managed to rank 17th in the 2nd grade. That night, the restaurants of the 100 Flowers Lane were brightly lit. The teachers and students of Orthodox Academy were very happy to celebrate. As for who placed first upon the first banner in this year's grand examination, besides those addicted gamblers, no one else really cared. What the world was most concerned with was the confluence of the North and South. Not long after the conclusion of the grand examination, the negotiations between the two sides finally achieved what could be described as a perfect outcome. In autumn, the confluence of the North and South would be formally signed. The sects and noble families of the South, which possessed countless cultivating experts and wealth, would finally be incorporated into the great Zhou dynasty. Although it was largely a nominal incorporation, it was still something that not even Emperor Taizong had been able to accomplish. For a moment, the entire continent was proclaiming the divine empress's might. The hidden flow that many people feared might appear was tightly controlled by the imperial court. Within the alley of the Northern Military Department, who knew how many fingers had been severed and how many ghosts had been added? Zhou Tong and those officials loyal to the Tianhai Divine Empress had also committed innumerable evil deeds in the record of merit. As for the most feared invasion of the demons to the south, it fortunately did not become a reality. It was said that this year, the snowy plains of the demon domain had experienced a series of violent snowstorms. The demon imperial clan and nobles of Xuelao City had placed all their thoughts on rescuing their own tribes and seizing the opportunity to attack. They did not spare a second glance towards the south. Just like all the ordinary people, Chen Chongsheng was also very happy, because this meant that the human world would be even more united against the demons, stronger and even harder to defeat. This also meant that Su Yurong's status would be even higher. At the same time, it was said that the White Emperor couple would be coming to participate in the signing ceremony, so Luoluo would also be coming, right? The Southern diplomatic mission gradually left the capital. South Stream Temple's convoy was the last to leave, but it still had to leave. To Su Yurong, the capital was her homeland, and Holy Maiden Peak was the place where she would spend her long years of cultivation. The wind and snow fell on the Bridge of Helplessness, as if they had returned to that day. See you at the Boiling Stone Summit. See you. Chen Chongsheng and Su Yurong stood on the snowy bridge, saying goodbye to each other. He held up the yellow paper umbrella and watched her figure gradually disappear into the wind and snow. He did not feel too much sorrow at parting. The Boiling Stone Summit was in the summer, and they would soon meet again. Moreover, he would eventually go to South Stream Temple. On the contrary, his mind became even calmer and steadier, not only for her but also for himself. He firmly believed that he would definitely be able to defy the heavens and successfully change his fate. He would be able to live past 20, then past 200 year after year. Because right now, he was no longer alone. He wanted to live a long life together with her. In the past, he had only thought about how he had to live, but he had rarely thought about it, and of course, he had never experienced that living itself was a beautiful thing. Only on that day when the white veil fell from the Bridge of Helplessness and he saw her eyes did he understand something. From that day onwards, he changed a great deal. He still lived calmly and attentively, but his life was much more natural and casual. To put it another way, the current Chen Chongsheng lived more vividly, no longer as dull and even wooden as before. This change in his spiritual world also affected the efforts he had made to live. He continued to read, study, meditate, and cultivate. The 5 stone pearls on his wrist, although not even the faintest bit of qi was released, were even more useful than the most precious of crystals. He continued to study the swords that Su Li had taught him, as well as all the swords in the world, but he also did not forget to study the 108 blade. His cultivation was becoming more and more stable, getting closer and closer to the peak of ethereal opening. The star radiance that descended every night slowly accumulated in his meridians and apertures, waiting for the day when it would shine brightly. And his future was certain to be bright. It had been almost 2 years since he had come to the capital. It had already been a year since he had entered the Lingyan pavilion and seen Wang Jitsu's notebook. He still had 3 years. In this year, he had not once thought about defying the heavens and changing his fate according to the words in Wang Jitsu's notebook. Even though he had already obtained the recognition of the entire world as the next pope, logically speaking, he had the best chance and the best conditions to make the entire world dance and change the appearance of the sea of stars. But he would not do this because this would cause too many people to die. He believed that he could use 3 years to cultivate to the saint realm, step into the divine domain, and then attempt to reconnect his meridians. This sounded inconceivable, impossible, but since he had only used 2 years to go from a young Taoist from the countryside who knew nothing to the current candidate for pope, a young expert who could already see the threshold of the star condensation realm, what else could he not do? The word impossible had no meaning to him, because he could not avoid the possibility. Chen Chongqing was advancing, and so was the entire world. This was truly worthy of being the age of blooming wildflowers. After that generation of geniuses like Wang Po, Xiao Zhang, Sun Mei, and Liang Wangsun, even more geniuses had emerged. The many proclamations issued by the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets were officially updated in the spring of this year. This time, the proclamations had undergone enormous changes. First of all, the tier of legendary weapons, which had remained unchanged for many years, finally welcomed a change. The Frost God Spear was still ranked first. The Having Blade was ranked second. The Wooden Sword Little Phoenix was ranked third. The Reborn Heaven Shrouding Sword was ranked fourth. Everyone knew that this was because the person using the sword was too powerful. This was also the truth. No matter how powerful a divine weapon was, only in the hands of an even more powerful person could it display its true power. The Orthodoxy's magical artifact, the Vault Sheath, which had been painted gray due to its loss, once more ascended to the stage of the cultivation world. The newly written characters were abnormally clear. The sword called Stainless was ranked 95th, in front of the 6 Protection's divine armor, but it was still far inferior to the 69th ranked Dragonscale sword. Perhaps this was also the reason. The divine weapons on the tier of legendary weapons naturally attracted attention, but what people truly cared about was still the people themselves. The proclamations of Carefree, Golden Distinction, and Azure Cloud had also been updated. The name of the chapter was originally called A Lot of Updates, but thinking that it would definitely be drowned in spittle, I changed it to this artistic. Chapter 556. There was nothing new about the new proclamation of Azure Cloud. The most famous one was actually Xian Yuan Po. In Elder Tianji's concise and comprehensive evaluation, he gave an extremely high evaluation of the compatibility between this Bear Tribe youth's cultivation technique and his body. As for the other new names, most of them were youths that were not even 15 years of age, and not many people recognized them. On that night last year, Chen Chongqing had caused the entire sky to be filled with starlight in the Mausoleum of Book. The first level of ethereal opening, which was the most difficult for cultivators to surpass, had been easily passed by many people. The tragic scene of 3 or 4 out of 10 years in the past did not occur, and those familiar names on the proclamation of Azure Sky were naturally removed from the proclamation and moved to the proclamation of Golden Distinction. Tang 36 had left the proclamation of Azure Sky, but he had not been able to enter the proclamation of Golden Distinction. With his current level of cultivation at the upper level of ethereal opening, this was something that would have been very difficult to imagine in previous years. Upon hearing this news, he remained quiet in the Orthodox Academy for a very long time. Only after confirming that Zhixiu and Su Moyu had not entered the proclamation did he become happy once more. With Chen Chongqing's assistance, Zhixiu's tide rush of blood had not been cured, but he had broken through in cultivation. Coupled with his innately powerful and terrifying battle prowess, the only reason he had not been able to enter the proclamation of Golden Distinction was that the injuries he had received in Zhou prison had been too severe, and it had been a very long time since he had shown himself. The fact that Tang 36 and Su Mo you were unable to enter the proclamation of Golden Distinction could only mean that the competition for this year's proclamation of Golden Distinction was too fierce. The demi-humans had an extremely small number of people on the proclamation of Azure Sky, but on the proclamation of Golden Distinction, they were able to fully display the demi-human's characteristic of being able to exert power in the middle stages of cultivation, occupying a full quarter of the spots. Amongst them, the top 3 demi-human experts were even believed by the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets to be able to threaten the position of the demi-human expert Xiaoda, who was ranked 5th on the proclamation of liberation. The most surprising was Zhong Hui. This third upon the first banner from last year's grand examination, had been greatly overshadowed by Chen Chongxing and Go Hanshi, to the point where many couldn't even remember his name. Who could have guessed that in a short span of a year, he had broken through to the peak of ethereal opening, seizing the 4th place upon the proclamation of Golden Distinction. Unfortunately, no matter how outstanding the performance of this young scholar from Scholartree Manor was, he was still unable to completely suppress the dazzling brilliance of some people. Go Hanshi had spent half a year viewing the monoliths in the mausoleum of Book. After returning to Mount Li, he had a duel with an initial level star condensation expert of Xiao Songgong's faction by a cold stream, and had easily won. Just this battle was enough for the Elder of Heavenly Secrets to personally place him 3rd on the proclamation of Golden Distinction. There was no 2nd place because the 1st place was tied with 2 people. Upon seeing these 2 names, whether it was the common people of the capital or the female disciples of South Stream Temple's outer sect, they all silently shook their heads and sighed. Chen Chongxing and Su Yurong. Regardless of whether the marriage contract was invalid or not, it seemed that these 2 names would always appear together. In many people's eyes, this wasn't fate, but rather the entanglement of fate. It wasn't something good. Then what about the name that had always been associated with Su Yorong all these years? Qiu Shanjun had already succeeded in star condensation, so he naturally wouldn't remain within the proclamation of Golden Distinction. He gave the 1st place to Chen Chongxing and Su Yurong. But what shocked the entire continent was that his name had not been seen on the proclamation of liberation. Qiu Jun was too young, so it was naturally impossible for him to be mentioned in the same breath as those experts at the top of the proclamation of liberation. No one would believe that the current him could challenge powerful figures like Wang Pu and Xiao Zhang, but with his level of strength and cultivation, he should at least enter the bottom ranks of the proclamation of liberation. If he really could enter the proclamation of liberation, even if he was in the last few ranks, he would still be the youngest expert to enter the proclamation of liberation in 100 years. The entire continent had been anticipating the arrival of this day, but it had come up empty. The Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets explanation for this matter was that because of the opening of the Garden of Zhou and the subsequent scheme of the demons, coupled with Mount Li's internal strife, Qiu Shanjun had been heavily injured and had not fought for an entire year. As a result, it was impossible to judge his current level of strength, and could only leave it for later. This explanation was very clear, but it was very unconvincing. What sort of place was the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets? Even if Qiu Shanjun had not fought, how could it not have determined his level? Moreover, when the proclamation of Azure Sky was updated last year, Xianyuan Po also had no battle achievements, so how could he have been ranked? The Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets gave no further explanation. Very few people knew the true reason. The world was very lively, but Mount Li was very quiet. Before leaving, Su Li had instructed the disciples of the Mount Li Sword sect not to be afraid of trouble, but also not to cause trouble. The north and south converged, the winds and clouds surged. Those people of Zhou and the noble clans of the south were too treacherous and cunning. Since they were no match for them, they should just stay in the mountains and quietly live their lives. These were his exact words. After Su Li left, some dregs of desire arose once more. The strongest second-generation experts of the Sword Hall of Mountly, because of their injuries, were all quietly recuperating. Right now, Go Hanshi and the other third-generation disciples were in charge of affairs. Many people believed that these young swordsmen would find it very difficult to stabilize the situation in Mountly, but after that bloody battle in the mountain stream and Guan Feibai's enraged severing of 16 hands, they proved to the entire South why the Divine Kingdom's 7 laws were called the Divine Kingdom's 7 laws. It was because they strictly abided by the commandments and their sword hearts were brightly lit. In the future, they would assuredly enter the Divine Kingdom above the sea of stars. After eliminating the last effects of the internal strife, Mountly finally regained its peace. Go Hanshi and the others focused on reading, cultivating, and growing vegetables. In these peaceful days, they comprehended the true meaning of the path of the sword. On a certain night, Go Hanshi awoke from his meditation and gazed at the distant mountains. He saw that the starlight was like silver, and the once familiar scenery suddenly had a different charm to it. He thought of the difficult times he had spent with his weak mother as an orphan, and his eyes faintly glistened with tears. His body faintly overflowed with starlight, also sparkling and translucent. "Congratulations, second brother!" Guan Feibai, Liang Banhu by Kai, and the several dozen third-generation disciples of the Mountly Sword sect gazed at the beautiful scene by the cliff and happily shouted. Go Hanshi turned to his junior brothers and said, "The sea of swords is boundless, but you and I should bravely advance." Guan Feibai said, "Back in the grand examination, if Chen Chongqing had not gone mad and wanted to put his life on the line, and if senior brother had not taken pity on his difficult cultivation, how could you have allowed him to seize first rank of the first banner? Now that senior brother has successfully broken into star condensation, I wonder if he will still have the face to bring this matter up when we meet at the Boiling Stone Summit." Go Hanshi calmly replied, "Chen Chongqing has never brought this matter up. Besides, a defeat is a defeat. Is not daring to put his life on the line glorious? And let alone the fact that I am older than him, so what is there to be proud of in being a step ahead of him on the path of cultivation? Junior brother, your words are extremely inappropriate." He hasn't said it, but everyone is saying, "The future Pope, Tisk, truly a grand sight." Guan Baifei's face was cold and arrogant as he said, "Senior brother, you have a kind heart and don't want to lose face for him, but I don't care. When the time comes, we will definitely have to fight." Go Hanshi shook his head. "If you really want to win, there's no harm in waiting until after the war with the demons. You can compete with him to see who can kill more demons." Hearing the word demon, Liang Banhu slightly lowered his head. Bai Kai somewhat worriedly glanced at the dwelling bathed in starlight behind him. Liang Xiaoxiao was colluding with the demons, and he was Liang Banhu's twin brother. As for that person in the dwelling, his mother was a demon. Logically speaking, Go Hanshi should have paid more attention to these details, but he deliberately did not avoid them. In his view, since they were all disciples of Mountly, they were fated to live and die together, Only by explaining these matters so thoroughly that no one cared was it in accordance with Mount Li's path of the sword. Seeing that the mood was rather gloomy, someone jokingly said, "If we're really talking about merit based on killing enemies, I think that neither fourth brother nor Chen Chongqing will be able to catch up to that wolf cub. This sort of thing can't be decided just by looking at whose swordsmanship is better." He had originally intended to make fun of them, but the mood only became even gloomier. In the current Mountly, there were some names that could not be mentioned. The door to the dwelling slowly opened and Qi Jian walked out. She had already changed into women's clothes, but the childishness still remained on her face. Her figure was thin, and she was extremely pitiful. Guan Feibai said, "Junior. Sister, it's late and chilly. You still haven't recovered from your illness, so why did you come out?" Qi Jian softly said, "I heard you all mention him." Guan Feibai advised, Even though that wolf cub won several of our matches in the grand examination, I didn't feel any ill will towards him. On the contrary, he's a rare person that I somewhat admire, but Marshal Granduncle did it for your own good. In the end, he's still a demon. So what? Qi Jian's pale face was brimming with stubbornness. My mother is a demon princess. If he can marry her, then why can't I marry a demi-human? Guan Feibai was at a loss for words. He muttered, but Marshal Granduncle said that he doesn't have long to live. Qi Jian's face paled even more. Could it be that whatever he says is right? Ever since Su Li had placed the order of confinement, Qi Jian had never called him father again. Go Hanshi sighed and prepared to say a few words of advice. There's no need, Qi Jian sorrowfully said. If eldest brother were here, he would definitely help me think of a way. He wouldn't be like you all, only knowing how to trap me in the mountain. Mount Li's Marshal Granduncle had left, and Mount Li's eldest brother had also left. No one knew where he had gone. His name could not be seen on the proclamation of liberation, and it was like he could no longer be found in the world. In the distant snowy plains of the north, there was a not very famous military stronghold called Seven Li Shi. It was said that many years ago, this place was the territory of the Shi tribe. Later on, the Shi tribe was completely massacred by the demons heading south, and the human army won the northern expedition and occupied this place. This place was closest to the demon army and farthest from the human world. Today, the generals and deputies of the stronghold were holding a meeting that very night. Smoke lingered in the air, their worried faces could be seen everywhere. It was not that the demon wolf cavalry had come to harass and kill again, nor was it that there was a problem with the supply of provisions in the rear. On the contrary, Seven Li Shi had been very peaceful in the last few days. Even the wine sold in the taverns in the city had been watered down, and those cold and indifferent cultivators were now smiling. In their clashes with the demon wolf cavalry, the roaming cavalry of Seven Li Shi had obtained many inconceivable victories. The generals and deputies were currently worrying about how to calculate the merits of this roaming cavalry unit, especially that young officer. Chapter 557. I've never seen an officer as perfect as him. Not only is he powerful, but he's also able to dig out the potential of everyone in his troop. Chuncho, you're their commanding officer, so you should be well aware of the lazy and incompetent appearances of the members of that troop. Everyone admits that he played a role in these battles, but if you want to talk about perfection, drinking and fighting every day, just how perfect is that? Do you still want military discipline? I agree to give him merit, but in return, shouldn't we punish him for violating the ban? If he was my subordinate and could bring back the corpses of Tensum Wolf cavalry every time he went out on patrol, let alone drinking and fighting, as long as he didn't commit murder or arson, I could accept anything. Punishment? I want nothing more than to wash his feet every day. Haven't all of you forgotten the most important problem? He's a subordinate sent by the Northern Expedition Army Headquarters. I hear that he offended some important figure over there, so he was sent to this damned place where even birds don't shit. If we put his name in the record of military merit, won't the Army Headquarters have something to say about it? Even if the Army Headquarters has something to say about it, are you going to suppress his merit? You're going to make the soldiers feel bitterly disappointed. Who said we were going to suppress his merit? Aren't we just trying to find the most suitable method? Don't say any more. Merit is merit, and what should be punished must be punished with the merit he's accomplished these past few days. It's even possible for him to be conferred a noble title, but with the ban he's violated in these past few days, beheading is also reasonable. I see that the two sides are at odds. Give him a commendation order, and as for the reward, withhold it for now. The noisy tent instantly fell silent. Everyone turned to the general sitting at the very front, subconsciously wanting to object. However, upon careful thought, this was actually the best method. They couldn't help but all turn to the deputy general called Chen Cho, their eyes filled with sympathy or schadenfreude. Chen Cho was very angry. Picking up his helmet from the table, he lifted the curtain and left. The reason his colleagues were taking pleasure in his misfortune or sympathizing with him, the reason he was angry, was because everyone was well aware that with that young officer's personality, upon hearing this news, he would assuredly fly into a rage. And no one, not even the general, was willing to directly face that fellow's rage. What? Only a commendation and no reward? The layout of the barracks was simple and crude, and the items were heavy. Fortunately, the wooden table in the middle, which held the oil lamp and a dozen or so wine pots, was not overturned. Upon learning of the results of the discussion in the tent, Chen Cho naturally did not have a good expression, but he had not expected the other party to react so fiercely. He hurriedly hugged the other party and repeatedly consoled, "The order of commendation is the good thing. The general gave this to you under pressure from the military headquarters." The man whom he held so tightly that he did not tear everything in the curtains to pieces in his rage was an officer. The officer's armor was covered in dust, and so was his face. Coupled with his beard that hadn't been trimmed for a long time, he looked very dirty. His eyes were bright and clear. Only by looking at his eyes would people realize that he was only a young man in his 20s. The young officer struggled free of Chen Cho's hand, walked over to the table, picked up a pot of wine, and poured it down his throat. He angrily said, "I just won't accept it." Chen Cho helplessly said, "My little ancestor, could it be that you're only lacking that bit of money?" The young officer slammed the wine pot on the table and said, "I just won't accept it. Why? I've earned so much merit. Could it be that I can't even exchange it for 50 taels of silver?" Chen Cho glanced outside the barracks and said, "Last time, you killed the prisoners too ruthlessly." The young officer waved his hand and said, "Where did that rumor come from? How could I do such a bloody thing? Only you Zhou soldiers like to do this sort of thing. Pay attention to your words. Although you're a southerner, we only have one army right now. Fine, since we're all one family, why aren't you willing to give money? Why do you want money so badly? If I don't want money, what else can I want?" The general said that if you're willing to register, with the speed at which you accumulate military merit, you'll quickly surpass everyone in the 7 Li Shi, and even Chen Cho looked at him, his emotions somewhat complex. "In 5 years, you might become a new divine general." Hearing these words, the young officer froze for a moment, then began to laugh. "I'm not interested in that." If someone in the great Zhou army heard these words, they would assuredly believe that person to be a madman. But Chen Cho did not react with any shock, because this was not the first time he had heard something like this. "Who are you?" He looked at the young officer and asked. The young officer replied, "I'm just a young man who loves money and is easily angered." As he said this, his eyes were extremely calm. In truth, when he was about to flip the table and curse the general's mother, his eyes were similarly calm, without any true anger. Chen Cho sighed and said, "I don't know what sort of eccentricities people like you have, but why do you have to pretend to be coarse people?" The young officer moved closer and earnestly asked, "Could it be that I don't pretend to be one?" Chen Cho sized him up, then said, "Your attire, appearance, and temperament are all somewhat similar, but your eyes aren't." Back then, he had been able to see that this young officer was no ordinary person precisely because of his eyes. Whether he was facing the 100-some wolf cavalry or that demon expert, this young officer's eyes were always so calm. This sort of calmness represented absolute confidence, and could give one a great deal of confidence, whether it was the young officer himself, the 40-some roaming cavalry under his command, or Chen Cho, his nominal deputy general. After this period of interaction, Chen Cho was increasingly sure that this young officer was a truly important figure. Only a truly important figure would have this sort of gaze, and only a truly important figure would be disdainful of something like becoming a divine general. If he had not confirmed that there were no problems with the assignment document, Chun Cho would never have dared to keep this young officer in his army. But even today, he still could not understand why such an important figure would come to such a desolate and dangerous place as Seven Li Shi, and why he had come here. Tonight, he finally couldn't help but ask. The young officer gazed at the snowstorm outside the tent, smiling. He was rather tired, but very serene, without the slightest impatience. He did not answer Chen Chou's question, indifferently saying, "Drink." Although Chen Chou knew that this person was an important figure, they were still his subordinates in the stronghold. Moreover, they had bathed in the snow and bathed in the frost, had gone through life and death together, and had fought many bloody battles against the demon wolf cavalry. They had long since become extremely familiar with each other, so he couldn't help but feel somewhat annoyed. "All you know how to do is drink, drink. I'm seriously asking." The young officer was a little startled, then began to roar with laughter. "I'm also very seriously answering." Then his smile gradually faded, and he calmly said to the snowstorm, "The wine here is the strongest, and it can kill the most demons. It can help calm one's heart. At 8 o'clock in the evening, there will be a chapter." Chapter 558. To use strong wine to calm one's heart with the blood of one's enemies. These words, when carefully tasted, were truly heroic. Chun Cho was quiet for a while, then said, "I know that at the very beginning, you were drowning your sorrows in wine because of a woman." The young officer smiled and said, "Yesterday, I received a letter from her from the south. She found the man she thought was dead, and coincidentally, that man was the fiancé she disliked the most in the past. Tell me, should I congratulate them or congratulate them?" Chen Cho looked at him with much more sympathy. Patting him on the shoulder, he comfortingly said, "Then it really is over. Don't think about it any more." On that night when they were besieged by the wolf cavalry on the snowy plains, the two of them had chatted about many things. Of course, the topic they talked about the most was men and women, so he had a rough idea of what the story was about. The young officer's eyes suddenly brightened, as if they wanted to illuminate the dark night before him, the snowstorm in the dark night, and the road ahead through the snowstorm. He calmly and firmly said, "No, if that person really was dead, I naturally wouldn't be able to defeat him, wouldn't have any hope. But now that he's alive, for me, it means that hope has reappeared." At the end of summer and the beginning of autumn, the Boiling Stone Summit was about to begin. People from all over the continent were beginning to set out. Unlike the Grand Examination or the Garden of Zhou, the Boiling Stone Summit was not famous. It was only circulated among the upper echelons of the cultivation world, and only those people with the qualifications to be invited knew of it. Every time the Boiling Stone Summit was held, it would be held in the Heaven Lake in the cold mountains of the distant northeast of the continent. Whether one set out from the capital, Tianliang County, or the south, it was a very long distance to reach the Heaven Lake. To many people, rather than calling the Boiling Stone Summit a grand meeting of the cultivation world, it was better to call it a journey. Of course, to cultivators at that level, travel had always been a kind of cultivation, so not many people would use immortal birds or arrays. Instead, they would follow the official roads of the human world that extended in all directions, cross the rivers that were as dense as cobwebs, take in the scenery, and sincerely advance. According to legend, countless years ago, countless meteorites transformed into streams of fire and fell on the continent. Many of these meteorites landed where the capital was today. The yellow earth was at the tip of the mausoleum, and those meteorites transformed into heavenly tome monoliths, opening the continent's life and intelligence. This was the current mausoleum of books. Besides those meteorites that had fallen into the mausoleum of books, there were also many meteorites that had turned to ash in the sky. There were also many meteorites that had once again returned to the sea of stars. There were also some meteorites that had been lucky or unlucky. They had not fallen into the mausoleum of books, nor had they been completely incinerated. They had become broken pieces of true stone that had fallen to the earth. They were called heaven stones. Miraculously, those heaven stones had not been scattered throughout the continent. Instead, just like the mausoleum of books, the vast majority had fallen in the same place. That was Mount Han in the northeast of the continent, especially near the Heaven Lake at the peak of Mount Han. The heaven stones had burned too fiercely, leaving no mysterious lines on their surface, much less any of the marvels of the heavenly tome monoliths. However, they were still existences that shared the same origin as the heavenly tome monolith. To cultivators, they were still incomparably precious. It was said that many experts had used these heaven stones to successfully break through their original cultivation levels. What the boiling stone summit boiled was heaven stones. Of course, it was impossible for countless stoves to be lit on the shores of the Heaven Lake to boil water. Boiling stones had always been done in the Heaven Lake, because the water in the Heaven Lake was condensed from hot springs. Its temperature was extremely high, like a furnace created by the heavens and the earth. The Boiling Stone Summit was a grand gathering held by the human world for the sake of increasing the cultivation speed of cultivators. Any cultivator that could rank at the very top of the Boiling Stone Summit had the right to obtain a heaven stone to comprehend and sense. The marvels of the heaven stones were far inferior to the heavenly tome monoliths, but the heavenly tome monoliths were in the mausoleum of books, while the heaven stones could be brought along and interacted with day and night. Thus, to cultivators, the importance of the heaven stones was actually not above that of the heavenly tome monolith. To some people, it was even more important. After Emperor Taizong returned to the Sea of Stars, the 5 saints and the storms of the 8 directions decided on when to hold the Boiling Stone Summit, and it was arranged by the Elder of Heavenly Secrets. As for when it would be held, it would depend on the cultivation of the younger generation of experts in the cultivation world at the time. Only after confirming that their cultivation levels were sufficient to comprehend the heaven stones would it be held. After Emperor Taizong's generation gradually withdrew from the stage of history, the cultivation world became increasingly cold and cheerless. The Boiling Stone Summit would not be held once in several decades. It was only after Wang Po's astonishing feat that the cultivation world once again entered an era of blooming wildflowers. Only then did the frequency of the Boiling Stone Summit gradually increase. The most important goal of the Boiling Stone Summit was to allow the cultivation geniuses of the human world to obtain assistance at crucial moments in their cultivation, so that they could break through the barrier of knowledge as quickly as possible and advance. As a result, very few people were invited. For example, this year, there were only 30-some young cultivators on the list. On that list was the famous name of the Heavenly Tao Academy's Guan Bai, so it was only natural that Qiushan Jun was on it. Naturally, there was also Su Yorong and Chen Chongxing, as well as Go Hanshi and the 4th-ranked Zhong Hui of the Proclamation of Golden Distinction. Zhixiu and Tang 36 had not been able to ascend to the Proclamation of Golden Distinction, but this did not mean that the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets did not view them favorably, so they were also on the list. Besides these familiar names, there were also a few obscure wandering cultivators and experts from small sects on the list. These wandering cultivators and experts were all around 40 years of age. Amongst cultivators, they were rather young, but compared to the young geniuses on the list, they were clearly much older. Several hundred orthodoxy cavalry escorted several carriages into the capital. These orthodoxy cavalry and divine generals were indifferent, their bodies exuding a somber aura, but they could not stop the determination and courage of the common people of the capital to watch the spectacle. Mao Chuyu and Ling Haijiwang sat in 2 separate carriages, their eyes closed in rest as if they could not hear the shouts coming from outside. Those shouts were all for the people in the carriage behind them. In the carriage, Tang 36 put down the list in his hand and scratched his somewhat itchy ear from the shout. Shaking his head, he said, "It's not like you know what we're doing, so why are you shouting so loudly?" And also, rower, last night I just gave you 1,000 taels of silver, so why are you putting on this show of sending off your husband? He gazed at the mournful young dancer leaning against the railing of a building by the street, the expression on his face rather unnatural. No one paid attention to him, and no one paid any attention to him, or else he would have been even more embarrassed. Jeshio's eyes were closed in rest, his true essence scraping at his somewhat deformed meridians like little knives, but no pain could be seen on his face. Chen Chongqing was reading a scroll of the Taoist canon, his expression very focused and serious. In his sea of consciousness, he was constantly calculating how to break the array left behind by Wang Jitze. Tang 36 felt somewhat ashamed, thinking, why can't I be like them, completely unconcerned about everything? Listen, someone actually guessed that you went to South Stream Temple to propose. The crowd on the street suddenly exploded with shouts. When Tang 36 heard this, he rocked back and forth with laughter, feeling very happy. Only these people could think of something like this, but this array really is rather similar. If you want to marry the holy maiden, you naturally have to send out 2 prefects of the orthodoxy. He was speaking of Mao Qiyu and Linghai Jiwang in the carriage in front of them. Only Chen Chongqing and the others were going to the Boiling Stone Summit this time, but they were sending out an extremely large array, with 2 archbishops personally escorting them. This was because Chen Chongqing's current status was no longer the same, and the journey was long. Mount Han was not far from the land of demons, so who knew if the demons would have any designs on this future pope? With 2 experts at the peak of star condensation overseeing it, it would presumably be much safer. Chen Chongqing still had his head lowered, reading his book without any reaction. Tang 36 finally felt that something was wrong. Patting him, he asked, "What are you thinking about?" Chen Chongqing raised his head and took out 2 balls of fur from his ears. Somewhat perplexed, he asked, "What's wrong?" Tang 36 was very speechless. Pointing at the paper, he said, "Shouldn't you be concerned about what sort of opponents you'll encounter in the Boiling Stone Summit?" Chen Chongqing stared blankly, then smiled. "I don't plan on entering the arena." To cultivators, heaven stones were naturally extremely precious objects of comprehension, but to him and Su Yorong, this sort of comprehension had almost no effect. With the heavenly tome monoliths in their hands, what need was there to care about heaven stones? Besides broadening his horizons, he had gone to the Boiling Stone Summit because he wanted to see a few people. For example, Wang Po, who might appear in the Heaven Lake because of Scholartree Manor's bell. For example, Go Hanshi and the other disciples of the Mountly Sword sect that he had not seen for a very long time. For example, Su Yorong, whom he had not seen for very long. Tang 36 said, "That's right, you're the future pope, so it's truly not suitable for you to compete with us. In addition, you can now enter the Mausoleum of Books at will, see whichever heavenly tome monolith you want to see. Take a girl with you to see a heavenly tome monolith." Chen Chongqing glanced at Jishio. Only when he realized that Jishio was not paying any attention to their conversation did he relax. Seeing his nervous expression, Tang 36 shook his head and placed the paper in his hand. "Since you won't enter the arena, our strongest opponents will definitely be those fellows from the Mountly Sword sect. The demihumans will also come, and I hear that even that Xiaoda of the Proclamation of Liberation will come." Upon hearing the name Xiaoda, Jishio suddenly opened his eyes and asked, "Are you sure?" "I'm basically sure." Tang 36 creased his brow and asked, "You have a grudge with that guy?" Jishio asked, "If I had a grudge, would you help me?" Tang 36 said matter-of-factly, "Of course not. That's an expert in the top 5 of the Proclamation of Liberation. Am I that familiar with you?" On the long journey there were new sights but not too many new stories. Chen Chongqing spent the vast majority of his time on the carriage reading, cultivating, and thinking, treating Jishio's injuries, and then the 2 of them would watch Tang 36 grow more and more acrimonious and unkind out of boredom. Occasionally, Mao Chuyu would find him to chat about a few things, but besides eating in the wilderness, he had never seen Ling Haijiwang. Just when the summer was about to depart, the convoy finally arrived at Mount Han. This place was already the extreme north. After passing through the endless mountain ranges, one would enter the domain of the snowy plains of the demon realm. Moreover, as the mountains rose, the temperature dropped, as if deep winter had come early. The armor of the orthodoxy cavalry was gradually covered in a thin layer of frost. Chapter 559. Mount Han was this mountain range, and it also referred to the tallest, solitary peak. Chen Chongqing raised the curtain and silently gazed at that solitary peak. He compared it to the solitary peak behind Xining village, but he didn't know which peak was taller. The solitary peak he was familiar with in the cloud grave occupied an incomparably vast area, but he would never know how high it was, as it was obscured by clouds. Suddenly, he somewhat missed the old temple outside Xining village, missed his teacher and senior brother. Before entering Mount Han, there was a small village. It was said that this was the last place that ordinary people could settle down for a long time. Perhaps because there were cultivators all year round from the Heaven Lake, the small village was not desolate. It was rather lively, with more than 2,000 people living there. Unlike the ordinary people of other places, the people of this small village were well aware of the matters of the Boiling Stone Summit. When they saw the convoy from the Li Palace and the orthodoxy cavalry, they had long since respectfully moved aside. They were under the care and jurisdiction of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, but they were also believers of the orthodoxy, so they did not dare show the slightest disrespect. Somewhat unexpectedly, the convoy stopped outside the small village. After a while, Chen Chongqing heard Mao Chuyu's message. The people of the village heard that you were also in the convoy and wanted to see you. Chen Chongqing was a little surprised, but he didn't think too much about it. He thought, since they want to see me, then so be it. He got up and prepared to walk out of the carriage, but he was stopped by Tang 36. You're prepared to go out like this? Tang 36 asked him. Zhixue looked at Chen Chongqing and also shook his head. What's wrong with me like this? Chen Chongqing looked at himself. Because of the long journey, he was wearing the most comfortable cotton uniform. After sitting for a long time, it was unavoidably wrinkled, but it was still very clean. He did not feel that there was anything wrong with this attire. Tang 36 took out a new set of clothes and threw it over. You have to be a little more serious at a time like this, because they're very serious. Chen Chongqing took the clothes and realized that it was a Taoist robe that the Li Palace had sent over in the spring. The materials used for this Taoist robe were extremely particular and meticulously tailored. Most importantly, it was embroidered with a brocade design that represented one's status. He was still not the Pope, so he could not wear the divine robe. This robe was specially made to represent his status as the future Pope. Ling Haijiwang had refused to meet him on the entire journey, probably because he did not want to see him wearing this Taoist robe. Who would have thought that Chen Chongqing had never worn it even once? Chen Chongqing put on the new Taoist robe and with Tang 36's help, he arranged all the details. Chen Chongqing's expression became more and more serious. Tang 36 was right. The people who were waiting to greet him were very serious and solemn, so he really should be more serious and solemn. Is that okay? After putting on his Taoist robe, he looked at Tang 36 and Zhixue and asked. Zhixue nodded. Tang 36 said, You've also forgotten the most important thing. Chen Chongqing's hand landed on the hilt of his sword, then slowly left. A wooden staff exuding a faint holy aura appeared in his hand. I'm going, he said to Tang 36 and Zhixue. Then he took the wand and walked out of the carriage with steady steps. The world outside the small village instantly grew quiet. In the distant snowy mountains of Mount Han, the cries of young eagles resounded. Countless believers knelt down like a tidal wave, forming a dense mass of people. Several hundred orthodoxy cavalry also kneeled. Chen Chongqing wore a Taoist robe and held a divine staff in his hand. He stood in front of the tide, his youthful face somewhat nervous. He did not know how to handle this sort of situation. He strove to recall those important figures he had met, the Pope, Su Li, and the Holy Maiden. In the end, he thought of Su Yorong, and his nervousness gradually faded, transforming into calm and sincere gratitude. He gazed at those ordinary people piously bowing to him and said in a voice as steady as he could, "May the sacred light be with all of you." Bastard, where did he learn those words from? Really, this time, I can't watch him make a fool of himself. Tang 36 used his finger to lift a crack in the curtain and looked out in shock at the activity outside. Zhixiu did not get off the carriage, because he had no interest in this sort of situation. Tang 36 did not get off the carriage for another reason. In this sort of situation, he would not go out even if he was beaten to death, because the moment he appeared, he would have to kneel and pay his respects to Chen Chongqing. Last year, after the Pope had confirmed Chen Chongqing's position, Tang 36 had called an urgent meeting in the Orthodox Academy. In that meeting, he had clearly stated that if there really was no other way, and he had to kneel and pay his respects to Chen Chongqing outside, then once they returned to the Orthodox Academy, Chen Chongqing would have to kneel back. Zhixiu was well aware of the reason Tang 36 had not gotten off the carriage, but he was somewhat confused as to why he had not mocked and ridiculed Chen Chongqing like he usually did. Tang 36 gazed at the scene outside the carriage, his expression very calm and content, his thoughts inscrutable. He was thinking back to that conversation he had with Chen Chongqing on the great banyan tree in the Orthodox Academy. Perhaps in a little while, he would have to return to Wenshui to inherit his family's business, to shoulder his responsibilities, to be rich in the world, but to be trapped in a single city. But before this, he had been frivolous, had worked hard, had struggled together with his companions, and had even fulfilled his promise. Not far from the small village was the gate to Mount Han. Chen Chongqing was rather curious and asked, "Is the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets after this place?" The Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets was the most famous place in the world, but interestingly, very few people knew where the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets was. With Chen Chongqing's current status, if he wanted to investigate, he would naturally be able to, but just like when he first entered the capital, he would often display his ignorance of the common knowledge of the cultivation world. He truly was not too interested in these matters. In comparison, the knowledge in books was much more important. You idiot, if the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets were here, it would take so long to update the rankings. Without even asking, it was obvious that the only person who dared to speak to Chen Chongqing like this, and who liked to speak like this, was naturally Tang 36. Chen Chongqing pointed at the mountain gate and said, "But the 3 words Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets are written on it." Tang 36 had had enough of his stupidity in this aspect. The Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets presides over whatever matter, and that place is the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. For example, if the Boiling Stone Summit is being held right now, then this place is the Pavilion of Heavenly Secret. If the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets is holding an auction in Donchuan, then Donchuan is the Pavilion of Heavenly Secret. Chen Chongqing very seriously thought this over, but he still could not understand what was going on. On the side, Zhixiu commented, deliberately mystifying. In front of the mountain gate, the Orthodoxy cavalry stopped. Linghai Jiwang expressionlessly said to Chen Chongqing, "Don't lose face for the Li Palace." After saying this, he turned and walked down the mountain path. Chen Chongqing was somewhat confused. Mao Qiyu said to him, "We will escort you up to here. You will have to walk the rest of the path by yourselves." This was clearly the first time Tang 36 had heard of this rule. "Why?" Mao Qiyu replied, "This is the rule of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. No one is allowed to enter 500 li from Mount Han without permission." Chen Chongqing asked, Could it be that besides the people on the list, no one else is allowed to enter? Tang 36 replied, Of course not. When my father participated in the Boiling Stone Summit, the guardians of my clan followed him the entire time. No one is allowed to enter without permission. The Elder of Heavenly Secrets did not invite us into Mount Han, so we naturally cannot enter. As Mao Chuyu spoke of this matter, his emotions became rather complex. Chen Chongsheng was even more confused, thinking, the orthodoxy is the world's Taoist sect. No matter how strong the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets is, what right does it have to treat the orthodoxy with such disdain? Tang 36 casually said, Something must have happened between His Holiness the Pope and the Elder of Heavenly Secrets. Mao Chuyu glanced at him, then smiled and shook his head. He turned and walked down the mountain with the orthodoxy cavalry. Upon entering Mount Han, they were within the range of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, so safety was naturally the responsibility of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. Tang 36 had guessed correctly. There was assuredly some unknown grudge between the Pope and the Elder of Heavenly Secrets, so the Elder of Heavenly Secrets was very impolite to the orthodoxy, forbidding Mao Chuyu, Linghai Jiwang, and the others from entering Mount Han. However, he still did not lose his etiquette to the future Pope. A steward of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets was already waiting on the mountain path, his expression very respectful. Chen Chongxing recognized this person. It was the star condensation painter responsible for recording the martial exhibition in front of the Orthodox Academy. Today, Mount Han was opening and cultivators from all over the continent were on the path into the mountain. Chen Chongxing's group of 3, led by the steward of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, did not get very far before encountering several groups of cultivators. As expected, that rule of not entering without permission was directed at the orthodoxy. It was obvious that some of these cultivators were experts that had come to hold down the line for their junior disciples. But whether it was senior experts with profound cultivations or confident and proud young experts, when they saw Chen Chongxing's group approaching, they all hurriedly gave way. Those that could enter Mount Han were no ordinary people, so their eyes were naturally extraordinary. None of the cultivators had anyone to guide them, so they walked along the mountain path. Only Chen Chongxing's group of 3 had a high-ranking steward from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets to guide them, so they were naturally not ordinary people. When Chen Chongxing's group of 3 walked past them, they were recognized by someone. The mountain path was instantly filled with the sound of inhaling and suppressed exclamations. It wasn't enough for them to avoid Chen Chongxing. Everyone hurriedly saluted him. There was even a devout lone cultivator who directly knelt down on the mountain path and gave Chen Chongxing a big salute. Just when Chen Chongxing was prepared to do something, he suddenly saw a person in front of him. This person had a handsome face, a chill faintly visible on his brow. He wore a long yellow gown. It was Scholarly Manor's Zhong Hui. The young scholar from last year's grand examination had already become much steadier, and the qi exuding from his body had also become much stronger. The mountain path suddenly grew quiet. In last year's grand examination, the story between Chen Chongxing and the people of the Orthodox Academy and the students of Scholarly Manor, and even the subsequent events in the Mausoleum of Books, had long since been known by others. The atmosphere became rather tense. No one knew what Zhong Hui would do next, what Chen Chongxing would do next. After some time, Zhong Hui slowly bent his waist and clasped his hands to the ground. His posture was abnormally standard, his etiquette impeccable. Chapter 560. No one could see whether his current expression was resentful, unwilling, or expressionless. Time truly did change too many things. In this short year, Zhong Hui's cultivation had advanced by leaps and bounds, and he was now fourth on the proclamation of golden distinction. Yet these former competitors were no longer on the same level. What was being discussed here was not cultivation, but status and status. Even if their strengths were similar, Would Zhong Hui still dare to disrespect Chen Chongqing? The mountain path was still quiet. Countless gazes fell upon Chen Chongqing. He did not speak, so Zhong Hui had to maintain his posture of greeting. A hint of derision appeared on Tang 36's lips as he prepared to say something. Zhixiu shook his head. Time slowly passed. The steward from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets slightly creased his brow. No one dared to criticize Chen Chongqing, but they presumably all had a few voices in their minds. Chen Chongqing was not intentionally humiliating Zhong Hui. He just had not reacted, not expecting that Zhong Hui would greet him. Even in the small village at the base of the mountain, with believers prostrating in worship like a tide, he still did not have the self-awareness of being the future pope. Suddenly, the mountain path was filled with the sound of people sucking in cold air. Because Chen Chongqing had come. He clasped his hands and bowed, returning Zhong Hui's greeting without the slightest disrespect, his appearance impeccable. With his current status, he only needed to lightly say a few words when Zhong Hui respectfully bowed to him. But he very seriously returned the greeting, and he even used the etiquette of peers of the same generation. The seemingly frozen atmosphere instantly melted. The crowd looked at Chen Chongqing with deep emotion and admiration. Everyone was happy. Other than Tang 36, he said in a voice that only Chen Chongqing and Zhixiu could hear, "Does reading too much lead to this?" Chen Chongqing looked at him and asked, "How about it?" Tang 36 replied, "Become like Go Hanshi." Chen Chongqing replied, "Thank you." In his view, becoming a person like Go Hanshi was naturally a form of praise. Tang 36 sneered, "Hypocrite." Chen Chongqing stared blankly for a moment, then helplessly shook his head and continued forward on the mountain path. The hundred-some cultivators that had entered Mount Han very naturally followed behind him. No one dared to walk in front of him. The team on the mountain path now looked a little imposing, but they didn't go far before they stopped again. This time, it wasn't because an old friend appeared on the mountain path and had a story with Chen Chongqing. It was because someone intentionally blocked the middle of the mountain path. Chen Chongqing didn't know that person, but many people did. Fifth on the proclamation of liberation, the youngest general of the demi-human race, and reputed to be the most talented expert of the two shores of the Red River in the last 100 years, aside from Princess Luoluo. This demi-human expert had a very cute name, Xiaoda. But everyone who knew him knew that this demon race expert was definitely not cute, and was very frightening. "You are Chen Chongqing?" Xiaoda said as he watched. The black hair at his temples danced high in the air, and as he looked around, he exuded an unyielding aura. Regarding this question, even with Chen Chongqing's patience that far surpassed that of a normal person, he was still somewhat tired of hearing it, so he only nodded his head and did not say anything. But in Xiaoda's view, Chen Chongqing's silence was an insult to him. In other words, he had always been waiting for Chen Chongqing to humiliate him so that he could use this opportunity to vent his anger. "I will beat you to death," he said to Chen Chongqing in all seriousness. A tawny light suddenly surged out of his clear and clean eyes, and his body exuded an extremely powerful and terrifying qi. Chen Chongqing was somewhat confused, because it was obvious that this demi-human expert was specifically targeting him. Of course, this person could not actually beat him to death. He had intentionally said such ruthless and unreasonable words and put on such a crude appearance just to humiliate Chen Chongqing. The problem was that because of Luoluo, he had always had a good relationship with the demi-human race. Last autumn, he had even received a reward from White Emperor City. The people on the mountain path were all paying attention to the change in the scene. Just as Chen Chongqing had thought, everyone knew that this Yao elite couldn't really kill Chen Chongqing, but this didn't mean that this Yao elite didn't have the ability to do so. It was only because Chen Chongqing's identity was a little special. No matter how astonishing Chen Chongqing's talent was, to the point where even ordinary initial-level star condensation cultivators were no match for him. There was still an extremely large gap between him and the top 5 experts of the Proclamation of Liberation. It had to be known that Xiao De was someone who could even fight head-on against Wang Pu and Xiao Zhang. You don't understand? Tang 36 asked. Chen Chongqing nodded his head. On the 2 shores of the Red River, there are countless young experts who wish to marry Princess Luoluo, and whether it is in terms of talent in cultivation, strength in cultivation, or background, Xiao De has always been the person with the greatest hope. That is to say, if nothing unexpected happens in a few more years, he should be marrying Princess Luoluo, and if Princess Luoluo is unable to inherit the White Emperor's technique, he will become the sovereign of the demi-human domain. And all of this has become a bubble because of you. After listening to Tang 36's explanation, Chen Chongqing looked at the demi-human expert on the mountain path and instantly felt something different. You changed the condition of the meridians in Princess Luoluo's body, which is tantamount to changing the rules of the demi-human domain for tens of thousands of years. Whether from this perspective or from your relationship with Princess Luoluo, if I were Xiao De, I would truly have ample reason to kill you. After saying this, Tang 36 walked forward to stand in front of Xiao De. Xiao De's body did not seem particularly tall or sturdy, much thinner and weaker than Xianyuan Pe, but he gave off a particularly heavy and massive feeling. This feeling was the pressure exuded by a true expert. Tang 36's expression was extremely grave. He understood better than anyone else on the mountain path that if this demi-human expert went crazy, he really would dare to kill Chen Chongqing. Moreover, the problem was that no matter how he looked at it, this demi-human expert had a reason to go crazy. You know who I am, he said to Xiao De. Xiao De slightly narrowed his eyes, the tawny vicious light in his deep and serene pupils gradually fading. He raised his voice and said, "The young master of the Tang clan. Since you recognize me, then it's easy to talk. Your tribes have done business with each other for countless years, so you should be well aware that our Tang clan is a standard businessman. What business do you want to discuss? You want to marry Princess Luoluo? All the tribes on the 2 shores of the Red River, even the beasts deep in the mountains, know." Xiao De solemnly said, "You absolutely cannot tell me that because he is Princess Luoluo's teacher, I have to treat him a little better if I marry Princess Luoluo. Perhaps at a crucial moment, he might even speak up for me." Tang 36 froze. After a moment, he sighed and said, "Who said that you demi-humans have no brains?" Xiao De smiled. Presumably, it was a brainless human who said that. Tang 36 asked, "Then there's no way to discuss this business? Because this has never been business, but swindling." Xiao De smirked at him. "Given the friendly relationship between us, I naturally can't blame you, but tell me, is there any reason for me not to be angry at him? What's wrong with me wanting to beat him to death?" Tang 36 asked, "Just who is swindling me? When intelligence is needed, you are cleverer and calmer than anyone else. When you need to play the part of being furious and forthright, you bring out this side of you. If this is a business discussion, just which side of you should I be talking to? No matter which side of me you're talking to, you have to first state your conditions." Xiao De's smile faded as he expressionlessly said, "The 2 shores of the Red River, the ancient realm of demi-humans, countless people, I've lost so much, so how much can you make up for me?" Just when Tang 36 was prepared to speak, Chen Chongqing's voice rang out, very calm and very firm. "The 2 shores of the Red River, the ancient realm of demi-humans, countless people, these were never yours in the first place. You've never obtained them, so how can you talk about losing them?" He walked up to Tang 36 and said to Xiao De, "I don't understand the business conversation between the 2 of you, but I only know that, whether it's doing business or discussing business, one should not use something that is not one's own to exchange for a corresponding benefit." As he said this, he stared into Xiao De's eyes, his meaning extremely clear, and he had no intention of backing down. The 800 li of the Red River was never yours, nor was Lualua yours. Even if you're a demi-human expert on the proclamation of liberation, what right do you have to reason with me, discuss business, and ask for compensation? The mountain path was deathly still, not a single sound could be heard. If one were to say that the silence when he had met with Zhong Hui had been one of awkwardness and tension, then the silence now was even more unsettling. Because Chen Chongqing was facing a demi-human expert on the proclamation of liberation. He had caused this demi-human expert to lose far too many benefits, far more than Zhong Hui had lost. Moreover, even with the Wenshui Tangs acting as a buffer, this demi-human expert did not seem prepared to lower his demands for compensation, and Chen Chongqing displayed a rarely seen toughness. Xiao De suddenly began to laugh, his laughter somewhat deranged, the tawny luster in his eyes becoming the brightest dot on the surface of the water. Then he narrowed his eyes and said to Chen Chongqing, "It seems that you don't believe that I dare to kill you." Chen Chongqing replied, "I don't believe that you can kill me." This question and answer were actually speaking of two different matters. In Xiao De's view, even if the entire world acknowledged that Chen Chongqing's talent in cultivation far surpassed that of ordinary people, that he had reached the peak of ethereal opening at the age of 16, that he had consecutively defeated many initial-level star condensation experts in the capital, and that he had even defeated Su Yorong on the Bridge of Helplessness, he still only needed to extend his pinky finger and crush him to death. It was just that Chen Chongqing was the Pope's appointed successor, so he said the word dare. Chen Chongqing said the word can. He was naturally no match for an expert in the top 5 of the Proclamation of Liberation, but he did not believe that his opponent could easily defeat him. His confidence naturally had its origins, such as the countless swords in the vault sheath, or the 5 stone pearls in his hand, or the blade styles he had learned in the mausoleum of books. There were many, many more, but others did not know of this. Not even Tang 36 knew that he was concealing all of his strength, so he felt that these words were rather strange. This was a humiliation to an expert of the Proclamation of Liberation. Chapter 561. The moment Xiao De appeared, the steward of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had already secretly notified the people of Mount Han. However, when he saw the brown luster in Xiao De's beast eyes grow deeper and brighter, he knew that it was too late. He hurriedly prepared to protect Chen Chongqing, and then prayed that Mount Han would respond as quickly as possible. The moment that demi-human genius known for his intellect and madness decided to act, he had assuredly calculated everything. Even if he did not kill Chen Chongqing and only needed to humiliate this future pope, he might have accomplished his goal, but this was not something the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets was willing to see. There might have been some problems between the Pope and the Elder of Heavenly Secrets, but how could the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets just watch as the future Pope was humiliated on its own territory? Besides the steward of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, several dozen cultivators simultaneously gripped the hilts of their swords at their waists and warily gazed at Xiao De. As for that wandering cultivator that had kneeled before Chen Chongqing, his sword was already in hand, his eyes cold to the extreme. It was like if Xiao De dared to act, he was willing to sacrifice his life to protect Chen Chongqing's dignity. This was because the vast majority of the several dozen cultivators on the mountain path were humans, and they were all believers of the orthodoxy. How could they allow the future pope of the orthodoxy to be humiliated by the demi-humans? Xiao De gazed at those several dozen human cultivators, a hint of derision flashing through his eyes. His expression did not turn solemn. On the contrary, he held his hands behind his back, seeming extremely disdainful. With this action, his originally not very tall or sturdy body became a mountain. He looked down at these human martial cultivators from a lofty position. He was a true expert, his star condensation transformation already at perfection. He could even faintly see the dividing line between the divine domain and the mortal world. The saints and the storms of the 8 directions had not arrived. Besides the divine generals of the great Zhou at the very top, the powerful figures of the orthodoxy and the various sects, and the few people on the proclamation of liberation like Wang Po, Xiao Zhang and Liang Wangsun, who could be his match. A wind blew out of the forest, sweeping up the yellow leaves and bringing with it an unimaginable pressure. Whether it was the wandering cultivator wielding the sword or the several dozen human cultivators on the verge of battle, they all suddenly realized that they had lost the ability to act, and even the courage to act. The steward from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets also had a massive change in expression. For the first time, he felt intense regret over his arrangements for entering Mount Han. Why must the orthodoxy cavalry be forbidden from accompanying Chen Chongqing into the mountain? If Mao Chuyu and Ling Haijiwang were present, would this demi-human expert still dare to act so arrogantly? Zhong Hui, who had been standing at the back of the crowd, turned slightly pale, but his eyes became firm and fierce. With a muffled groan, he gripped the hilt of his sword. Zhixiu was expressionless. His knees slightly bent as he stared at Xiao Da's throat. Just like a hungry wolf, his eyes instantly turned red as he prepared to transform. Chen Chongqing stood at the very front and felt the pressure most clearly and strongly. It could even be said that the majority of the pressure released by Xiao Da had been borne by him. His expression did not change. He slowly raised his left hand in the howling mountain wind. He held a dagger in his left hand, which meant please. The sword was called stainless and the sheath was called the vault sheath. He was a sword hidden in its sheath, ready to reveal its true edge at any moment. In reality, whether it was the martial exhibition in front of the Orthodox Academy or the battle with Su Yorong on the Bridge of Helplessness, he had never completely revealed his full strength. Now that he was facing an expert at the top of the proclamation of liberation on the same level as Wang Po, he could no longer hold back. He did not know what the conclusion of the following battle would be, whether he would lose or be doomed, but he wanted to see if he could stab his opponent with his sword. Any one of the 10,000 swords in the sheath would do. Or perhaps he wanted to see if he could strike this person with his blade. Any one of the 108 blades he had comprehended in front of the broken monolith hut would do. Seeing Chen Chongqing's expression, Xiao Da's eyes narrowed even more, as if he had become a tiger dozing in the sunlight. However, the gaze between his slits was even colder, the tawny vicious light even more brutal. He was rather surprised that this person was even stronger than the rumors said. It seemed like he really did have the ability to resist him for a few moments. Please make way. A person suddenly walked up from the mountain path. This person was dressed in blue clothes. His head was lowered and his voice was also very soft. He gave off a very humble feeling, or perhaps it was better to say that he did not leave behind any impression. The crowd gradually parted, opening a path for this blue-clothed man. Thank you. The blue-clothed man lowered his head and continued to walk up. Only when the path was opened did the crowd realize that the situation was rather strange. The qi in front of them had already been completely controlled by the qi exuded by the demi-human expert. No one could move, not even draw their swords. Why was it that when this blue-clothed man asked the crowd to make way, they could move? Zhong Hui gazed at the back of the blue-clothed man, his eyes revealing an extremely complex expression. Today, when he had just entered Mount Han, he had encountered Chen Chongqing and had been forced to lower his head in greeting. He had also seen so many experts. He, who had made enormous progress in the past year and could not help but feel proud, suddenly understood something. The blue-clothed man walked along the mountain path. He seemed to be moving very slowly, but it did not take long for him to pass through the crowd. He passed by Tang 36 and Zhixiu, brushing past Chen Chongqing, and then he arrived in front of Xiao Da. Even now, his head was still lowered and his shoulders drooped. No one could see his face. Seeing the blue-clothed man's back, Chen Chongqing was somewhat shocked. Please make way. The blue-clothed man said to Xiao Da, his voice very low and his attitude very humble. Xiaoda did not make way, his eyes narrowing even more. He had once seen a person who liked to wear blue-clothed, and that person also liked to droop his shoulders. If he had not seen that person before, he might have mistaken this blue-clothed man for that person. Because in his eyes, this blue-clothed man was just as frightening as that person. However, that person's drooping shoulders seemed more like a wordless attitude towards the sky. His poverty was suffused with nobility, calculating the accounts of his shop, yet he was worried about the world. This blue-clothed man's drooping shoulders were an attitude towards the secular world. In his eyes, the world was filled with dead people. His shoulders drooped so that he could more quickly pull out his sword. Xiaoda did not recognize this blue-clothed man, so he did not intend to make way. His breathing suddenly became berserk, howling like a mountain wind. He released all his cultivation and qi, and the pressure instantly became even more frightening. Yet the blue-clothed man seemed not to sense anything. He still quietly stood in front of Xiaoda, his head lowered and his shoulders drooped. The blue-clothed man did nothing. He just stood there in an ordinary and unremarkable manner, yet he seemed to vanish. This was the truly frightening thing. After some time, the blue-clothed man moved. With his head lowered, he began to walk up the mountain path. Xiaoda's expression was cold and stern. His two palms came down from beyond the heavens and brought together in front of him. Countless stones and tree bark were swept up by a fierce gale and slammed toward the blue-clothed man. For a moment, the mountain path was thrown into disarray and the yellow wind filled the air, blurring one's vision. Suddenly, a sword glow lit up, illuminating all the wind and sand and cutting apart the terrifying pressure. Chapter 562. In the shattered sandstorm, a furious and unwilling howl resounded. The wind calmed and the sand settled. The mountain path once more became clear and bright. The demi-human expert on the proclamation of liberation had already disappeared. A small pool of blood remained on the ground. The blue-clothed man was still standing at his original position, still standing, his head lowered, his shoulders drooping. Only his right hand that was exposed outside his sleeve was slightly trembling. There was no sword in his hand. That beautiful and strange sword glow seemed to only exist in his imagination. In reality, other than the special situation in Xuanyang City, very few living people had ever seen his sword. The scene was deathly still. Everyone stared at the blue-clothed man on the mountain path, utterly shocked. Just who is this person? A hidden expert sent by the orthodoxy to protect Chen Chongqing? The demi-human expert that had been defeated in one move did not recognize this blue-clothed man. No one recognized this blue-clothed man, not even the most experienced and knowledgeable person. Suli had once very disdainfully commented on this blue-clothed man, saying that all assassins with names were not good assassins. But in reality, besides powerful figures like him and Zhu Luo, no one knew who this blue-clothed man was. Chen Chongqing knew who he was. On the 10,000-li journey from the snowy plains of the demon realm to the south, this blue-clothed man had always been secretly watching them. At the time, he believed that the blue-clothed man was waiting for an opportunity to strike, but later on, he realized that he was protecting them. Then, in that storm in Xuanyang, the blue-clothed man finally took out his sword. With one strike, he reversed the situation. Just like just now. He walked behind the blue-clothed man and said, "Many thanks." The blue-clothed man turned around and expressionlessly said, "Even without me, he still wouldn't dare to kill you." As he gazed at this ordinary face, Chen Chongqing suddenly realized that this face was truly very hard to remember. He had actually forgotten whether or not he had looked like this in Xuanyang City. "Even if he doesn't dare to kill me, I don't want to humiliate me. If it were in the past, I would definitely want to see just what sort of methods you had to deal with it." The blue-clothed man looked at the sword in his left hand. It was very obvious that he was certain that Chen Chongqing was hiding some sort of method. Then why did you help me so early today? I couldn't let anything happen to you. Why? The blue-clothed man looked into his eyes and very seriously said, Because you are Big Brother's disciple. Chen Chongqing was startled for a moment before realizing who his big brother was. He shook his head and said, No. You are Big Brother's disciple. The azure-clothed man did not care at all and said, So you are Big Brother's disciple. Chen Chongqing felt very helpless. Even if Senior Su taught me a sword style, with your personality, you still don't care about my life or death. A son pays his father's debt, and a disciple pays his teacher's debt. The blue-clothed man looked at him and said very seriously, He ran away, so you should pay for him. Of course I can't let you die. Chen Chongqing didn't understand and asked, What debt? The man in blue said, Back then, he brought us into this line of work, but he ran away by himself. Now he's even further away, so you can only come back and continue to lead us. Chen Chongqing stared blankly for a while before saying, I remember that you guys have a second place? The man in blue said, He went to chase after Big Brother. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind them. Is that a woman? The speaker was Tang 36. The blue-clothed man's expression froze, as if he had not expected that the secret that the second-ranked assassin in the world, the chief assassin, was actually a woman would be so easily guessed. Tang 36 proudly said, Sir does not need to look at me, nor do you need to admire me. Who am I? The blue-clothed man suddenly looked at Chen Chongqing and said, He's very similar to a person. Chen Chongqing had heard this many times, so he somewhat sorrowfully nodded his head. The blue-clothed man turned to Tang 36 and said, I don't like that person, so stay away from me. Otherwise, I'm afraid that I won't be able to hold myself back and kill you. Tang 36 was given a fright, thinking, This is a madman. But when he thought of the elegant manner in which this person had wounded Xiaoda with a single strike, he couldn't suppress his curiosity. Using his shoulder to nudge Chen Chongqing, he said, Don't say such nonsense, and quickly introduce him. Tang Tang, from Wenshui. Chen Chongqing said, This is Lu Qing. The blue-clothed man was naturally the third-ranked assassin in the world, Lu Qing. Upon hearing this very ordinary name, Tang 36 froze, feeling that it was rather familiar. Suddenly, he remembered and yelled at Lu Qing in shock. He extended his hands to shake hands as he repeatedly said, Idle, leave me a way to contact you. An assassin's greatest taboo was having their hands held by another, and Lu Qing was no different. Moreover, he deeply disliked Tang 36, so he naturally would not let him hold his hands. Chen Chongqing suddenly asked, Why do you like to droop your shoulders? Back in Xuanyang City, Lu Qing could be said to be extremely ordinary, his temperament and figure extremely ordinary, but he had not deliberately drooped his shoulders. It must be known that deliberate and easy to be remembered were the things that assassins needed to avoid the most. Lu Qing replied, I learned it from Wang Pu. I realized that I can use my sword faster this way. Chen Chongqing recalled that sword glow in the sandstorm and realized that Lu Qing's sword truly was 30% faster than it had been in Xuanyang City. An upper-level star condensation assassin was already the world's most frightening existence. If his sword was 30% faster, just how frightening would it be? It was no wonder that Xiaoda, a demi-human expert ranked 5th on the Proclamation of Liberation, was not a match for Lu Qing even in a situation where he did not launch a sneak attack. The storm in Xuanyang City had caused him, Wang Pu, Lu Qing, and even Su Li to change. Of course, it was a good change. Remember what I said to you. If he runs, don't even think about running, Lu Qing very seriously said to Chen Chongqing. Tang 36 had been listening for quite a while, but now he could no longer restrain himself. To have the future pope become the leader of an assassin organization, are you sober or not? Lu Qing froze. He truly had never thought of this question. Only now, when Tang 36 asked him if he was sober, did he finally sober up. Yes, who would give up being the ancestor of the Mountly sword sect and become some assassin leader? And who would give up being the Pope and become the leader of an assassin organization? This was truly a preposterous thought. It turned out that he had been this preposterous all these years. The expression on Lu Qing's face dimmed, and then he lowered his head, turned, and walked up the mountain path. He did not say another word to Chen Chongsheng. For some reason, his figure on the mountain path was so bleak and desolate that it made one feel sorrow. What's going on? Tang 36 watched as Lu Qing walked further and further away and yelled, I say, you still haven't given me a way to contact you, idol. Chen Chongsheng asked, say, why did he appear in Mount Han? Tang 36 somewhat reluctantly drew back his gaze and said to him, you idiot, coming to Mount Han at this time is naturally to participate in the Boiling Stone Summit. In this world, probably only he and the little black dragon would use the word idiot to describe Chen Chongsheng. You're the idiot. Zheshou's voice came from the side. An assassin coming to participate in the Boiling Stone Summit is seeking death. At 9 o'clock in the evening, there was another chapter. Chapter 563. Tang 36 finally awoke from his stupor and thought to himself, this really is the case. Lu Qing had no invitation, yet he had intruded into Mount Han. Wouldn't the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets kill him? Chen Chongsheng also could not understand and could not help but worry. Su Li had left, and the mysterious assassin ranked second had also left. When Lu Qing left, he really did seem like a lonely ghost walking in the darkness, as if he could be swallowed up by the sun of the day at any moment. He knew that a person like Lu Qing had assuredly had hands stained with blood and truly should not be sympathized with, but he had no way of controlling his emotions. After all, in Xuanyang City, they had once fought shoulder to shoulder against an enemy, and against the strongest enemy in the world. Just what do you think an extremely powerful assassin needs? Tang 36 suddenly said. He's definitely earned enough money. I think that what he wants to reclaim is a kind of life. Chen Chongsheng was somewhat confused, asking, life? These assassins like to fight, like to kill, but they're not madmen, so they really like people paying them to fight and kill. This way, they don't need to consider things like morality, turning fighting and killing into a daily job, and this is the life they pursue. Just what are you trying to say? Lu Qing and the others can be described as a group of dragons without a leader. They've become a group of lonely ghosts, and they want someone to bring them back to their old days. And then, although I don't have that kind of ability, I have money. They like this kind of life, so I'll give it to them. You absolutely must not let your imagination run wild, Chen Chongsheng very seriously said to him. Tang 36 very indifferently spread out his hands and said, I was just casually saying it, there's no need to be so serious. Zheshou expressionlessly said. He already thought it through, or else why would he be crying and yelling for Lu Qing to leave behind his method of contact? Tang 36 angrily said, if you don't have any evidence, then don't talk nonsense, or else I'll kill you. Chen Chongsheng glanced at him. Tang 36 hurriedly changed the topic. Don't you think that Xiao De's appearance just now was very abrupt? It had to be said that he had changed the topic very beautifully, because this matter truly was worth thinking about, and there were many doubtful points. Mount Han was a place controlled by the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. For Xiao De to be able to enter the mountain gate meant that he had received an invitation from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. In the end, he had made things difficult for Chen Chongsheng on the mountain path. Even if his strength was tyrannical and his actions arrogant, was he not afraid of angering the Pavilion of Divine Ordinance? And even if he did succeed in humiliating Chen Chongsheng, what good would it do him? Other than venting the anger in his heart, could it possibly offset the limitless disadvantages of simultaneously offending both the orthodoxy and the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets? Xiao De is different from ordinary demi-humans. For example, he's completely different from that devilish brat of ours. He's not simple and honest at all. On the contrary, He's extremely scheming and far-sighted. When Tang 36 brought up this matter, the more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was wrong. His expression became serious. Although he has sufficient reasons and excuses to humiliate you, for him to take such a big risk to do this, there must be a great benefit. But no matter how I think about it, I can't see where the benefit is. Unless someone is able to obtain great benefits from this matter, and then turn it into other benefits for him, Chen Chongqing will be thoroughly humiliated. For example, he will be beaten into a pig's head or even stripped naked. Who will benefit the most? Of course it won't be the Holy Maiden, nor will it be Princess Luoluo. Don't hit people, we're talking about serious matters, but those competitors. For the future Pope to lose so much face, the Li Palace will naturally take revenge. But, if someone uses this matter in the future, not even His Holiness the Pope will be able to say anything. If this is a scheme, it's extremely simple, even like child's play, but it can actually harm you. Why? Because you are the future Pope, worshipped by all, the holiest of holies. As a result, you are also the easiest to sully. Zhixiu, don't look at me like that. I didn't mean it as a pun. Chen Chongqing, see if my analysis is reasonable or not. Silence. Chen Chongqing and Zhixiu glanced at each other, both thinking, Tang 36 is truly worthy of being the successor of the Wenshui Tang clan. In such a short amount of time, he was actually able to analyze this sudden matter so clearly and accurately deduce the cause and effect. Yes, they now believed Tang 36's deductions. That demi-human expert had appeared too suddenly, his actions too unreasonable, so there had to be some reason hidden behind them. The orthodoxy's divine staff was already in his hands, but if he wanted to put on the divine crown and become pope, Chen Chongqing still had to face many trials. Today was a seemingly ordinary but actually rather dangerous trial. Xiaoda's goal was the two shores of the Red River, the sovereign position of the entire demi-human domain. Who could pay such a massive price to invite Xiaoda to take the risk of the Pope's divine retribution and attack Chen Chongqing? To be more precise, who had the right to promise Xiaoda so many benefits in the future? That person, or those people, were clearly on the verge of appearing. They were assuredly competitors for the position of Pope or the throne of the Great Zhou. Like the distant Tianhai clan in the capital or the nearby Linghai Jiwang at the base of the mountain. The powerful figures of the orthodoxy, because of the rules of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, were unable to enter Mount Han. Now that he thought about it, this matter was truly rather interesting. Because it was too coincidental. It had to be said that while some people's arrangements seemed crude, they were actually very clever and clumsy. If Lu Qing had not suddenly appeared in Mount Han for some reason, perhaps this scheme really might have succeeded. Your luck is pretty good, Tang 36 said. Zhixiu replied, this has nothing to do with luck. Yes, if they had not journeyed together for tens of thousands of li to the south, weathering the storms in Xuanyang City, and if Chen Chongqing had never left Suli behind to return to the capital, how could he have been so lucky? As they walked along the mountain path, acquainted cultivators gathered together to discuss the storm that had just occurred. At the very front, Chen Chongqing said to the steward from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, I have some friendship with that senior from before. Is it possible? The steward softly replied, of course there's no problem. The entire world knows what happened in Xuanyang City. Even if we don't give Su Li face, we still have to give Sir face. In truth, Chen Chongqing was well aware that the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets was still giving Senior Su Li face, but he had pointed it out. Of course, he cannot kill anyone in Mount Han. Even if he runs into an enemy, he can only flee. The steward concluded, otherwise, even the face of His Holiness the Pope and the Empress would not be good to use here. With the promise of the steward from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, Chen Chongqing felt much more at ease. He had never imagined that he would meet Lu Qing again so soon. And at this moment, Lu Qing was in an extremely dangerous situation. The mountain path made a slight turn and a clear stream greeted him. The cliffs on the other side of the stream were covered in trees. The yellow leaves, from light to dark, were so beautiful that it was difficult to distinguish the color or shade of the trees. All sorts of fruits grew on the trees, the branches hanging down so low that they seemed ready to snap at any moment. Near the stream, there were hundreds of persimmon trees. The branches were densely packed with yellow persimmons, looking like countless lanterns. Lu Qing stood by the stream, in front of these countless yellow lanterns. His hand gripped his sword, his face as pale as blood and his breathing ragged. His shoulders drooped terribly, not so that he could strike faster with his sword, but because he really was about to collapse. It was like an invisible mountain was pressing down on his body. Several thin streams of blood seeped out of his ears and the corners of his eyes. His head was like one of those heavy fruits in the forest, ready to explode at any moment because it was too ripe, or perhaps because it was too heavy, its branches would snap and fall off his neck. Either way, the result was death. Lu Qing's right hand that gripped his sword incessantly trembled, on the verge of losing its grip. Even now, he still had not unsheathed his sword, because he had no way of unsheathing his sword. At the same time, he did not dare to unsheath his sword at that person. A middle-aged scholar stood amidst the mountain of yellow leaves. His hands held behind his back, he gazed at those lantern-like persimmons, apparently checking to see if they were ripe or not. A pendant was tied to his belt. If one looked carefully, one might discover that it was a seal. There seemed to be nothing special about this middle-aged scholar, but when Chen Chongqing's gaze fell on him, the sky above the mountains suddenly darkened. Just who was this person? Chapter 564. Chen Chongqing didn't notice that the sky suddenly darkened. Because he was shocked. Lu Qing was the third-ranked assassin in the world. His swordplay had been taught by Su Li. He was extremely talented and had an extremely high level of cultivation. Most importantly, his will was extremely firm. Back in Xuanyang City, he had even dared to scheme against Zhu Luo, dared to stab him with his sword. Why was it that now that he was about to die, he did not dare to attack that middle-aged scholar? Could it be that this middle-aged scholar was actually stronger than Zhu Luo, and even more terrifying? Zhu Luo was one of the storms of the 8 directions. The number of people stronger than him could be counted on 2 hands. This middle-aged scholar was Biyanghong? Is it Nan Tai? Or was he the elder of heavenly secrets? No, the middle-aged scholar did not resemble any of the storms of the 8 directions. Could it be His Majesty White Emperor? Tang 36's expression was ugly. In fact, there was no need to calculate carefully. The real answer was already obvious. It was just that they, who were in the mountains, would never have thought of it. Because there was no reason for that powerful figure to appear in Mount Han, appear here, appear here. Besides Lu Qing, there were also a few people by the stream. Xiaoda and some subordinate demi-human experts. Some demi-human experts were scattered on the grass by the stream while Xiaoda stood in the stream. This great demon, who used a violent appearance to conceal the arrogance in his heart, was calm beyond imagination, and was absolutely realistic, looked at the back of the middle-aged scholar in front of him, and finally took off all his disguise. His pale face was filled with vigilance, and his brownish-yellow eyes were filled with despair. There was a sword wound on his body. Under the pressure of that middle-aged scholar's pressure, Lu Qing's eyes were bleeding and he couldn't even pull out his sword. He was well aware of how great the gap in strength between him and that middle-aged scholar was, which was why he was in such despair. However, despair did not mean surrender. His body emitted an increasingly violent battle intent. He was truly worthy of being a true expert of the top 5 of the Proclamation of Liberation. Previously, his performance on the mountain path seemed far below his reputation, but now, when he truly faced the shadow of death, when he faced the darkness that enveloped Mount Han, he truly displayed a fearless will. Xiaoda's gaze fell on Lu Qing's right hand. Lu Qing's hand that was holding the sword trembled slightly, looking very weak. Xiaoda was waiting for an opportunity. He knew that only by joining forces with this green-clothed swordsman, who had injured him, would they be able to fight for an almost impossible chance of survival in front of this middle-aged scholar. He believed that if he hadn't given up, then the green-clothed man definitely wouldn't give up. No matter how much the hand holding the sword trembled, it would eventually calm down. Unfortunately, the middle-aged scholar did not give them this opportunity. Just when Lu Qing's hand gradually steadied and Xiaoda's breathing gradually grew stronger, the middle-aged scholar turned around. A moment ago, the middle-aged scholar had his hands behind his back as he gazed at the lantern-like persimmons in the forest, like an official returning to his hometown to retire. The next moment, the middle-aged scholar turned around to look at them. His expression was calm as he resumed his identity as a peerless powerhouse. The appearance of this middle-aged scholar was very difficult to describe with words, because both peak star condensation experts like Lu Qing and Xiaoda felt like their eyes were shrouded in a faint layer of darkness, making it impossible to clearly see his face. As for Chen Chongqing and the others on the mountain path, they were even less capable of seeing his face. They could only see this world on the middle-aged scholar's face. The middle-aged scholar's face was covered in the words embroidered, painted with mountains and rivers. At one moment, it was a desert of endless yellow sand, at another, it was a majestic blue sea. As he raised his eyebrows and raised his lips, all things in the world moved with him. The scenery was incomparably vivid, yet it also carried an aura of absolute desolation. Because this world had all sorts of sceneries, but not a single person. Not a single person. Everyone was dead. Upon seeing the middle-aged scholar's face, Lu Qing confirmed his conjecture. His face paled even more and a trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his lips. That was because he had bitten his own tongue. This was the only way he could maintain his state of mind. A smear of blood surged out from the depths of Xiaoda's eyes, already beginning to go berserk. This was the sign that he was about to use the demi-human's secret blood technique. Their conjecture had been confirmed, so even if they worked together, they would not be able to fight for any chance of survival. They had to use their most secretive and powerful methods to fight with their opponent. And what made them even more sorrowful was that even if they fought with their lives on the line, they would not be able to continue living in this world. They only wanted to delay for a few moments, to let the saints know of what was happening by this stream. Only then could their deaths not be unjust. Fine, being killed by this powerful figure was not unjust no matter how they thought about it. The middle-aged scholar paid no attention to the thoughts of Lu Qing and Xiaoda. He did not even glance at them, even though they were two peak star condensation experts and were prepared to fight with their lives on the line. His gaze rested on the distant mountain path, on Chen Chongqing's body. With this gaze, snowflakes began to fall from the gloomy sky, falling on the mountain path and also falling on Chen Chongqing's body. Contrasted against the strange darkness, the snowflakes falling from the sky seemed extremely pure white, yet incomparably dangerous. The temperature on the mountain path rapidly dropped, becoming incomparably cold. Chen Chongqing and the others instantly felt their bodies freeze, and even the true essence circulating through their meridians became countless times slower. If this situation were allowed to continue, in a few breaths of time, let alone fighting, even walking would become extremely difficult. Sensing such terrifying danger, they naturally wanted to avoid it, but the mountain path was covered in snowflakes, leaving them nowhere to go. This was because although the snowflakes seemed soft, in reality, each thin flake of snow seemed to contain an unimaginable amount of the majestic power of the world. At this moment, a very concealed ripple of qi arose on the mountain path. At some point, the steward from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had used his spiritual sense to touch the secret treasure hidden in his sleeve, preparing to send a warning into the depths of Mount Han. With a light clap, the The secret treasure had just begun to give off chi when it was crushed by the snowflakes surrounding the mountain path. The steward's right arm had been reduced to pieces of flesh and blood. Enemy! The steward from the pavilion of heavenly secrets, brimming with rage and despair, howled into the depths of Mount Han. Before the howl could travel far, it was sliced into pieces by the snowflakes filling the sky, slowly falling to the ground like dust. At the same time, a stream of blood spurted out from the steward's lips, instantly frozen into countless dark red granules by the bitter cold and scattering all over the mountain path. The steward's body slowly fell to the ground, no longer breathing. Cries of alarm rose up from the mountain path. The cultivators participating in the boiling stone summit furiously stared at the middle-aged scholar by the distant stream. They could not clearly see the middle-aged scholar's face, but they could sense the scholar's indifference or indifference. To cast 10,000 flakes of snow with a glance, use an array to trap everyone on the mountain path, and then casually kill a steward from the pavilion of heavenly secrets, to this person, it truly seemed like a trivial matter. From the moment his gaze fell, the middle-aged scholar had always been staring at Chen Chongqing. What did this mean? At 8 o'clock in the evening, there was another chapter. Chapter 565. A shrill and panicked yell rang out, "Protect the king!" The king was a venerable, and the venerable on the mountain path was naturally Chen Chongqing. Those cultivators ignored the snowflakes in the sky and rushed in front of Chen Chongqing. Even Zhong Hui, his face cold, raised his sword and rushed forward. For a moment, the mountain path was filled with the sound of rushing wind, and then the sound of clothes and flesh being torn apart. The thin snow was like the sharpest divine weapon, cutting apart everything it encountered. Blood sprayed on the mountain path, condensing into dark red beads of ice that rolled everywhere. The cultivators blocked Chen Chongqing's path, all of them carrying light and heavy injuries. None of them had died, but their courage had gradually waned. Just who was the middle-aged scholar? Just which saint was he? He was no saint. He was the antithesis of all saints. Lu Qing's face was pale as he thought of these words. With a grunt, he pulled out his sword and thrust forward. Sword glows flashed like lightning by the stream bank. Xiaoda had finally waited for this moment. He also moved, even faster than Lu Qing. Countless blood vessels bulged out of his face, brown hair burst out of his skin, and his qi became even wilder as he lunged at the middle-aged scholar. The middle-aged scholar finally drew back his gaze from Chen Chongqing and looked at them, then slightly arched his brow. His arched brow caused the world to shake. The sword glows by the stream bank suddenly faded, accompanied by an ear-piercing crack. The sword in Lu Qing's hand had been cut in two. He fell to the grass, a bloody line appearing on his wrist from which blood constantly spurted out. He seemed to be in an extremely wretched state. Xiaoda was in an even worse state. Before he could even charge out of the stream, he had been slammed into the water by the power of the world. With a slap, he knelt down on one knee. The stream water splashed everywhere, as did his blood. His body had been strengthened by the berserk transformation and the blood disintegration secret technique, but with this kneel, his kneecap had been shattered into powder. But in the end, he had only knelt on one knee, not completely kneeling in the stream. This demi-human expert clenched his teeth and madly roared, doing his utmost to continue forward. Lu Qing was the same. As he spurted blood, he gripped the broken sword and continued to thrust forward. And at some point, his left hand had already grasped the other half of the sword. The middle-aged scholar was too powerful. Even if they put aside their differences and joined hands, they still could not defeat him. But they couldn't stop here, lie down or kneel. Because the human race and the demon race would never surrender before the fiend race. The middle-aged scholar smiled as he looked at the two people who were determined to die, dragging their crippled bodies as they rushed over. When he smiled, the mountains and rivers became bright and beautiful, but they were still lonely and cold, because there were still no people between the mountains and rivers, and no demons. In front of him, all humans and demons had to die. The deeper the middle-aged scholar's smile grew, the deeper the wounds on Lu Qing's and Xiao De's bodies became, until one could see their white bones. With 2 claps, Lu Qing and Xiao De were finally unable to approach the middle-aged scholar. They collapsed in front of the persimmon forest, blood spraying everywhere. Lu Qing closed his mouth, his face pale, not saying a word. As an assassin, since he was going to die, of course he should die in silence. Xiao De howled in rage like a wounded beast, pained and unwilling. When the tensome demi-human subordinates by the stream saw this, they finally overcame the fear in the depths of their hearts. Taking up their weapons, they charged at the middle-aged scholar. Especially the demi-human expert closest to the forest. Determined to die, he used the secret blood technique. His body suddenly grew incomparably large, and one could faintly make out the true form of an elephant. He let out a deep and furious roar, sweeping up the gravel and cold water on the stream bank as he charged at the middle-aged scholar. The middle-aged scholar seemed somewhat annoyed and carelessly waved his sleeve. Just like that, the heavy body of the elephant expert flew into the sky. As he flew into the sky, the mountainous body of the elephant expert constantly disintegrated, shooting out countless arrows of blood. In the end, he became several dozen lumps of flesh that smashed into the lower reaches of the stream. The other demi-human experts suffered even more miserable fate. Their arms and legs were severed, and some were even cut in half at the waist, but they did not immediately die. The banks of the stream were covered in blood and organs, as well as despairing and sorrowful howls of pain. Xiao De's eyes were filled with rage as he hissed at the middle-aged scholar, "I'm going to kill you." Previously on the mountain path, he had said that he wanted to kill Chen Chongqing, but that had only been a method of negotiation. However, because he truly did have this ability, his words were rather chilling to hear. Now, when he said that he wanted to kill the middle-aged scholar, it was more like the helpless laments of a child, making one feel pity for him. The middle-aged scholar paid no attention to his roar. Whether it was the top 5 experts of the Proclamation of Liberation or the third-ranked assassin in the world, they were all meaningless matters to him, not worth spending the slightest effort or time on. His gaze once more fell on the mountain path, on Chen Chongqing's body. The mountains and rivers on his face gradually dispersed, revealing a face that might or might not have been his original face. This face was very handsome, somewhat weathered like a green plum that had just bloomed, or like the legendary ancient Buddha of Sangarama Temple. He stood amidst the flesh and blood, amidst the endless howls of pain. He looked at Chen Chongqing, his expression calm and indifferent, yet also smiling. As snowflakes fluttered down, and the mountain path was bitterly cold. Everyone felt this way. Everything had happened too quickly. From the moment he turned the mountain path and saw the middle-aged scholar in the forest on the other side of the stream to the moment he turned and looked over, the steward of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had died, Lu Qing and Xiao De were heavily injured and on the verge of death, and tensome demi-human experts had either died miserable deaths or were living a life worse than death. In reality, only a few seconds had passed. Neither Chen Chongqing Zhixiu nor Tang 36 had had the time to do anything. Of course, even if they had done anything, it would have been meaningless. The middle-aged scholar was too terrifying. After Chen Chongqing had come to the capital from Xining, he had seen a few truly supreme experts, but whether it was Zhu Luo, Guan Xinka, or Biyang Hong of the Storms of the 8 Directions, they were all far inferior to this middle-aged scholar. Even the Holy Maiden of the South he had met in Xuanyang City seemed a level weaker than this middle-aged scholar. Could the Pope be stronger than this middle-aged scholar? Chen Chongqing had only seen the vast sea of stars in the Pope's eyes, but he had never seen the Pope personally take action, so he could not come to a conclusion. If he really had to find someone in his life of cultivation that could match this middle-aged scholar's cultivation, it could only be Su Li. And it had to be Su Li at his peak, in his best condition. Back in the snowy plains of the demon realm, when Suli had taken the heaven-shrouding sword from the yellow paper umbrella and slashed out a vast path of several hundred li to the south, the feeling it gave him was somewhat similar to what he felt now. Just who was this middle-aged scholar? Chen Chongqing suddenly recalled that when he left the garden of Zhou and delivered the yellow paper umbrella to Suli, he had seen that darkness in the distance. That darkness that rose from Shuilao City and enveloped half the sky. At this moment, Mount Han was also shrouded in that darkness. His face instantly paled beyond compare. Chapter 566. At the peak of Mount Han was a blue lake of unknown depth. Even though the surroundings were extremely cold, the surface of the lake still exuded a mist. On the cliffs by the lake, in the weeds, stones of various sizes could be seen everywhere. Of course, even more stones were still soaking in the lake. Some were at the bottom of the lake, some had their sharp edges exposed. Quite a few dragons and cranes that had flown over from the south for the summer stood on these stones, contentedly preening their feathers. This lake was the Heaven Lake, formed from a hot spring that had come from some unknown place. These stones were heaven stones. They had descended from the heavens in the early years of the primordial era. Although they were not like the monoliths in the mausoleum of books that received the worship of tens of thousands of people for generations, in this remote Mount Han, they lived more freely and enjoyed more of the wild. An old man sat on a stone by the lake, his eyes closed as if bathing in the sun to rest his mind. In the pavilions behind the stone, there were at least several hundred attendants and subordinates, but none of them made a sound. The Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had always been the most famous and most mysterious place on the continent. The various rankings issued by this place were the most impartial and objective, the most authoritative, and no one had ever dared to question them. It had an extremely resounding reputation in the world, and it also operated various merchant guilds with its tentacles reaching everywhere. Even the common people knew of the name of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, but very few people knew where it was. But to the powerful figures of the upper echelons of the cultivation world, the location of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had never been a secret. The Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets possessed countless properties on the continent, countless manors, and even 20-some famed mountains as dwellings. Wherever the Elder of Heavenly Secrets lived was the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. The old man by the lake was the Elder of Heavenly Secrets. When he closed his eyes to rest, everyone in Mount Han naturally had to maintain their silence. Suddenly, the Elder of Heavenly Secrets opened his eyes. His eyes, which were full of wisdom and vicissitudes, were filled with shock. He was the head of the storms of the 8 directions, his cultivation level unspeakably high, and he was especially skilled in calculation. What in the world could escape his eyes? What was it that could surprise even him? Without hesitation, the Elder of Heavenly Secrets raised his right hand and pointed at the mist on the surface of the Heaven Lake. A faint and tenacious chi traveled from his fingertip to the surface of the lake, instantly causing the mist to surge. In the surging mist, many images could faintly be seen. These images were reflected in his eyes, becoming countless fragments of thoughts. Just what happened? Why did you leave Shuilao City and adventure in Mount Han? How did you manage to hide from my eyes? Black Robe, is that you? The confluence of the north and south, of course the demons will find a way to destroy it, but there's no reason for you to come here in person. Besides, what's the point of coming here? 1,000 years ago, you were heavily injured by Zhou Dufu. Afterwards, you hid in Shuilao City to recuperate. Even when Black Robe planned to surround and kill Suli, you only used the night sky to help, not daring to take half a step out of Shuilao City. Wasn't it because you were afraid that Suli might explode and injure you? Then why do you dare to leave Shuilao City today? There can only be 2 reasons for you to leave Shuilao City. The first is that your wounds have healed, and the second is that you've found a method to cure your old wounds. That method is currently in Mount Han. Who is it? Is that him? What treasure does he have on him? Or do you just want to kill him? Why does Tianhai want me to see him? Is there any connection between the two? What exactly is it that even I can't see through? Qin Changxing, just who are you? If you wanted to kill Qin Changxing, why didn't you do it on the way? Why did you have to come to Mount Han? I understand, it was because Mao Chuyu and Linghai Jiwang accompanied him the entire way. It was even possible that the Pope had them bring a treasure of the orthodoxy with them. You were worried that they would hold you back. You were worried that this was a trap arranged by us. After that matter, whether it was you or us, everything seemed like a trap. So you chose to come to Mount Han to kill Qin Changxing. As long as you could hide it from me, it was fine. However, you did not expect that Lu Qing and Xiao De would see through it in advance, forcing you to buy so much time. Then, what comes next depends on what choice I make. Countless thoughts emerged in the mind of the Elder of Heavenly Secrets, countless calculations simultaneously carried out, countless minute qi condensing into a picture in his sea of consciousness. A bolt of lightning flashed through the clouds, a wisp of morning mist scattered before the light. In an extremely short amount of time, he had thought of so many things. At the same time, his fingers trembled in the lake wind, tearing countless paths through the mist on the surface of the water. An indescribably powerful qi enveloped the entire heaven lake. Countless stones left the grass, left the cliffs, left the lake water, and flew into the sky. The lake gurgled, bits of grass and mud rustled to the ground, the surface of the lake restless. Extremely far away from the summit of Mount Han, the sky was filled with floating stones. Every stone was a black dot, and between two black dots was an invisible line. Countless invisible lines weaved together to form a net. This massive net of stones enveloped an area of 500 li around Mount Han. The middle-aged scholar was within it. Yet the worry in the Elder of Heavenly Secrets' eyes did not lessen. On the contrary, it deepened. Even now, he still could not calculate just what on Qin Changxing's body could cause this person to leave Xuelao City and risk his life here. Snow slowly drifted down the mountain path. Dark clouds shrouded the mountains like night, and from the distance, one could faintly hear the sound of tearing. Qin Changxing had no idea that these were countless heaven stones floating in the air, transforming all of Mount Han into a cage. His mind was completely focused on the middle-aged scholar by the stream. In the next moment, his gaze met the middle-aged scholar's gaze. It was like a clap of thunder had exploded in his mind. His face grew even paler, devoid of any blood. Snow could cover up all color, and only blood could produce color. He had already guessed at who the middle-aged scholar was. At this moment, he understood the message in the scholar's gaze and knew why he had come. In a little while, what awaited him was not death, but an ending even more terrifying than death. Starting from that night in the old temple many years ago, this was the ending he feared the most. Dark clouds gathered at the summit of the mountains. Night had come. Mao Chuyu and Linghai Jiwang simultaneously sensed this and raised their heads to look into the mountains, their expressions abruptly turning grave. It's no good to make things too big. Mao Chuyu drew back his gaze and stared at Linghai Jiwang, his eyes sharp. His sleeves moved despite the lack of wind, his hands seeming to grasp something within them. Linghai Jiwang had an abnormally nasty expression as he growled, "It has nothing to do with me." The abnormality in Mount Han truly had nothing to do with Linghai Jiwang. Just as Qin Changxing and the others had deduced, as the strongest contender for the position of next pope, Xiao De's rebellion on the mountain path truly had been arranged by him and some people behind the scenes. But how could he have invited this darkness? Next chapter, 8p Rem. Chapter 567. In the darkness that shrouded the sky, what were those people in the mountains facing? What to do next? Without the slightest hesitation, Mao Chuyu lightly waved his sleeves and instantly traveled several li, heading towards the mountain path. Linghai Jiwang's face was ashen as he transformed into a stream of light and followed. With a flip of his right hand, he gripped a dazzling pestle of light. Just as the Elder of Heavenly Secrets had calculated, these two prefects of the Orthodoxy had been ordered by the Pope to escort Chen Chongsheng. As expected, they each carried a precious treasure, yet they found it impossible to take a single step onto the mountain path. They were forced to stop in front of the memorial arch of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secret. It was not because of the darkness, but because countless stones had suddenly fallen from the sky above the mountains. These stones were densely packed together like a massive net, completely enveloping all of Mount Han and exuding an extremely powerful qi. These stones were not ordinary stones, but heaven stones of the same origin as the heavenly tome monoliths. These heaven stones formed an array of terrifying power. Even the strongest expert of the divine domain would find it impossible to break this heaven stone array in a short amount of time. Although they had powerful cultivations and carried the precious treasures of the Orthodoxy, they still found it impossible to charge into Mount Han. Then those people in Mount Han, what about that person? The heaven stones rose from the heaven lake, from the grass and cliffs by the lake, from the Elder of Heavenly Secrets' fingertips. The Elder of Heavenly Secrets sat by the lake, the wrinkles on his face instantly multiplying, making him seem even older. However, his finger was still steady, incessantly writing something in the mist over the water. He was calculating, and at the same time, he was laying down an array. His body exuded an extremely powerful qi. Several thousand heaven stones flew to various parts of the mountains, floating in the air. Under the pitch-black curtain of night, they seemed to appear like stars, sealing off an area of 500 li. This was Mount Han, his place. Even if the middle-aged scholar that had come to Mount Han today was the strongest opponent he had encountered in his 1,000 years of cultivation, he was still confident that he could fight a battle with him. The heaven stones floating in the night sky weaved into a net. The very center of this net of stone was at the bend of the mountain path, by the stream, in front of the persimmon forest. It was right above the middle-aged scholar's head. That middle-aged scholar raised his head to look at the night sky and the dozens of celestial stones in his line of sight. His expression was still indifferent and didn't seem to be moved at all. In the distant lake on the summit, the Elder of Heavenly Secrets swayed. The wrinkles on his face did not increase, but they deepened. The middle-aged scholar looked at the peak and said expressionlessly, "Tianji, you want to trap me with such a simple formation?" His voice was like a clap of thunder, exploding between the mountains. The cultivators who stood in front of Chen Chongsheng were shaken. Some of the weaker cultivators even threw away the swords in their hands and covered their ears in pain. These scenes were vaguely visible in the mist on the lake at the summit. The Elder of Heavenly Secrets gazed at the scene in the fog and said, "If you can't trap it for a lifetime, you have to trap it for a while." The middle-aged scholar smiled and said, "Then you don't care about the lives of these juniors?" The Elder of Heavenly Secrets replied, "If you don't even care about your own life and death, who else can I care about?" These two supreme experts were separated by at least 100 li, yet they seemed to be talking face to face. Hearing these two simple words, the human cultivators and demi-human experts that had originally been filled with hope upon hearing the Elder of Heavenly Secrets' voice instantly fell into despair once more. The people of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets sitting cross-legged in the pavilion on the summit revealed expressions of reluctance, but they had nothing to say. If the Elder of Heavenly Secrets were to use his full strength, he still wouldn't be able to save those people on the mountain path and by the stream, but perhaps he could ensure that not all of them would die. But in that case, the Elder of Heavenly Secrets would have no way of maintaining the Heavenstone array that sealed off the 500 li of Mount Han. Those people that entered Mount Han were very important, the future of humanity. However, if they could seal that middle-aged scholar in Mount Han for a little longer, waiting for the experts of the human world to rush over and kill him, then humanity would assuredly welcome an incomparably beautiful future. In the short time it took for the Elder of Heavenly Secrets to discover the middle-aged scholar's tracks, He had made 40-some calculations and finally made his choice. If the deaths of those people could be exchanged for the death of the most terrifying enemy of the human world, then this was a worthy death. Even if one of those people was the future Pope. The Elder of Heavenly Secrets believed that if those people knew of the middle-aged scholar's identity, they would also make the same choice as him. The 10,000 Years Pavilion was a famous landmark of Western Tomb, its collection of books extremely abundant. A scribe was standing by the bookshelf, his hands holding a book as he read. This person was dressed in an ordinary long gown. The only thing unusual about him was the red flower tied to his little finger. This flower was very red, a very beautiful red, and also very special. It was not like any other red that was commonly seen. It had a different kind of beauty to it. The scribe's expression was very calm, seemingly very focused on his book. However, the red flower lightly trembling on his little finger indicated that his current mood was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. Perhaps it was because curses would occasionally come from outside the pavilion. The 10,000 Years Pavilion was a quiet and scenic spot. Who dared to curse outside? And who dared to curse at this scribe? The person cursing outside the pavilion was an old Taoist nun. In her hand was a half-bald horsetail whisk, already half-bald. It was actually Wu Qiongbai, who had been driven out of the capital by the Tianhai Divine Empress. The scribe heard the curses coming from outside the pavilion and could no longer maintain his calm. His brow furrowed deeper and deeper, and finally, he sighed and prepared to say something. At this moment, a faint ripple suddenly came from the eastern sky outside the 10,000 Years Pavilion. The scribe's expression subtly changed. His body swayed and he vanished from the bookshelf. In the next moment, he was outside the pavilion. The old Taoist nun saw that the scribe had finally appeared and inwardly felt proud, but her face was still filled with loathing. She looked at him and said, "Your son doesn't care, but does your wife also not care?" The scribe ignored her. He continued to stare into the blue sky to the northeast, his complexion very unsightly. The old Taoist nun was enraged and extended her hand to grab him. The scribe snorted coldly and angrily flicked his sleeve. Then, he lightly stepped on a lotus leaf in the lotus pond in front of the pavilion. His body suddenly vanished into the air. The old Taoist nun heavily fell to the ground, her cheeks red and swollen. She covered her face in a daze. Ever since her marriage, she had never suffered such treatment. Just when she was prepared to let loose a torrent of curses, she finally sensed something strange in the sky. Her face paled and her heart instantly palpitated. At this moment, she only hoped that she had not delayed the moment her husband had flicked his sleeve. The Myriad Willows garden outside Hangzhou City was still scorched earth. Although some time had passed, no tender maidens had been reborn. Zhu Luo stood by the lake, silently gazing at the ruined scenery before him. In the last few days, he had been handling the affairs of the Zhu clan and the emotion-severing sect, at the same time waiting for the day Wang Per returned to Tianliang County. His mind was somewhat exhausted. A man wearing a bamboo hat stood at his side. It was none other than the Storms of the Eight Directions, Guan Xingke. Suddenly, a patch of black ash fell on the edge of the bamboo hat. Guan Xingke faintly sensed it and looked to the eastern horizon. He suddenly saw that the sea of clouds several thousand li away had darkened somewhat. "Something's happened. You go." "Okay." Chapter 568. Countless footprints suddenly appeared in the scorched earth of the Myriad Willows garden, as if they were stars. Guan Xingke's figure had already vanished, or perhaps he had already left Tianliang County. Zhu Luo gazed into the distance, an extremely complex expression on his face. He had actually gone to Mount Han? If this were back then, he would naturally have gone with Guan Xingke to Mount Han. Just like those experts on the continent who had received the message from the Elder of Heavenly Secret. But he was already old and injured, simply incapable of hurrying over. Suddenly, He felt a shred of regret for that matter in Xuanyang City last year. If he had not gone to kill Suli back then, he would have had the chance to kill that person today. This was what he should have done. Even if he died, he should have done it. There were not many figures flying towards Mount Han, but they were all the strongest experts of the human world. On the distant shore of the Red River, the majestic and imposing White Emperor City was quiet, everything normal. The only thing that was somewhat strange was the white cloud at the top of the city wall. In the imperial palace of the capital, the summer sun shone on the dew platform. Those night pearls were also dazzling in the daytime. The Tianhai Divine Empress stood in this light, gazing into the distance, her expression indifferent, her thoughts a mystery. In that secluded hall in the deepest depths of the Li Palace, the Pope quietly gazed at the green leaf before him, his thoughts a mystery. In the snowy plains to the north of Mount Han, even though it was midsummer, the wind was still bone-chilling and the snow blew without end. A person stood in the snow. If one did not walk up close, it would be impossible to discover his existence, because his entire body was white, from head to toe, from his hair to his clothes, so white that it was terrifying. In Mount Han, the middle-aged scholar gazed at those heaven stones floating in the air. He no longer conversed with the elder of heavenly secrets, falling silent. Could this also be a trap laid down by the humans and demi-humans? The stones in the sky slowly drifted down. Several dozen stones, covered in moss, water, and gravel, floated around his body, a rather strange sight. The middle-aged scholar arched his brows, a chill appearing in the depths of his indifferent and emotionless eyes. The lonely and uninhabited world on his face began to stir with the wind and snow. The wind and snow on the cliffs began to stir, sweeping towards those stones. Countless sharp cutting sounds could be heard as snowflakes fell on the surface of the stones. These heaven stones shared the same origin as the heavenly tome monolith. They came from beyond the heavens and were not ordinary objects. Even the divine weapons on the tier of legendary weapons would find it very difficult to leave a mark on them. The wind and snow condensed by the middle-aged scholar could easily slice those upper-level ethereal opening cultivators into pieces, but it was unable to slice those heaven stones. However, the momentum of the celestial stones slowly encircling him was blocked by the majestic power of the wind and snow. By the lake on the distant summit, the wrinkles on the face of the elder of heavenly secrets deepened and the expression in his eyes grew even more solemn. In the present world, only the elder of heavenly secrets had the right to judge the middle-aged scholar's strength, because he was the oldest of the 5 saints and the storms of the 8 directions. He had come from the age of blooming wildflowers and had personally witnessed that world-shaking battle. He had not expected that his opponent, who had been hiding in Shualao City for 1,000 years and whose injuries had not yet healed, would be even more frightening than before. Separated by 100-some li and aided by the heavenstone array of Mount Han, he was still not his opponent's match. Moreover, he had suffered internal injuries from a single clash. He truly was worthy of being publicly acknowledged as the strongest expert in the history of the demon race. If not for the appearance of Zhou Dufu in the human world, perhaps he would have already become the master of this continent 1,000 years ago, right? The wind and snow and the heaven stones continued to collide. The elder of heavenly secrets' face grew paler and paler. He realized that the heavenstone array of Mount Han truly could not hold his opponent. But he had to persevere, because as long as he could keep the middle-aged scholar trapped in Mount Han for a little longer, the powerful reinforcements of the human world might arrive. Whether it was the closest Zhu Luo or Guanshinka, or the fastest Wuqiong Bai, as long as they hurried over, this sudden battle that was highly likely to change the situation of the continent might turn the tables. The human world might very well win its best chance of victory in the last 1,000 years. The middle-aged scholar knew what the elder of heavenly secrets wanted to do. He was confident that this was not a trap laid down by the humans, because just last night, neither the military advisor nor he himself had imagined that he would appear in Mount Han today. After losing in the Central Plains, he returned to Shuilao City and had not come out since. It had already been 1,000 years. A powerful figure of his level had its own destiny. His words, actions, thoughts, and decisions coincided with the heavenly Tao, making it very difficult for others to calculate his plans. White Emperor City was too far, and he was also very sure that Tianhai and the Pope were in the capital. But if he really was delayed by the heavenstone array of Mount Han for too long, the situation really might change. He had never liked change because change was often trouble. Now it was his turn to make a choice. Should he take advantage of the fact that no change had occurred to use all his strength to break the array, leave Mount Han, and return to his own country, or should he stay a little longer and first finish that task? When the Elder of Heavenly Secrets made the decision to sacrifice the human cultivators and demi-human experts on the mountain path and by the stream to trap him in Mount Han, he had probably very quickly hesitated. To him, there was no need for any hesitation in this choice, even no need for a choice. Because in his view, that task did not require too much time. In his eyes, that youth was truly no different from an ant, even if that youth was a cultivation genius that had shocked the entire continent. He no longer paid any attention to those heaven stones slowly descending through the wind and snow. Drawing back his gaze, he once more turned to the mountain path. Chen Chongqing and those human cultivators were on the mountain path. He was very calm, even a faintly discernible smile on his lips. As the middle-aged scholar's gaze fell once more, the people on the mountain path all despaired. On the grass by the stream, Lu Qing also despaired. Even Zhixiu and Tang 36 despaired. Chen Chongqing did not. As he gazed at the smiling and silent middle-aged scholar, he inexplicably thought of a person that he should not have thought of at this time. It was that middle-aged woman who had once sat across from him in the 100-herb garden and drank tea. Perhaps because neither of them spoke, he felt that the middle-aged scholar and that middle-aged woman were rather similar. Of course, he knew that this was definitely a misconception, because he already knew who this middle-aged scholar was. He knew what he had come to do. On that night when he was 10, eldest brother had waved his palm leaf fan the entire night and said to him, only a saint could control his greed and desire for him. In the following years, he paid great attention to concealing the strangeness of his body, all the way until he was in the garden of Zhou, when that fragrance was smelled by the great Peng and Nank. The middle-aged scholar was Nank's father, or perhaps this was how he knew. And he was naturally no saint. He was a demon. Chen Chongqing felt that in the eyes of the middle-aged scholar, he was naked, lying on a wet chopping block, his stomach already cut open, his body covered in blood. He did not fear death, but he truly feared this sort of feeling. He did not want to be eaten like a fish. Today's chapter. Chapter 569. Facing what might be the most powerful existence in the world, facing the most wretched possible end, Chen Chongqing was afraid, nervous, uneasy, but he did not despair. When he was 10 years old, he had already experienced despair. He was used to it and knew that it was useless. He gazed at the middle-aged scholar by the distant stream, his right hand gripping a button in his sleeve. The middle-aged scholar seemed to realize something. His gaze suddenly became even sharper, the cold light like a sword. A terrifying chi spread out in all directions of the mountain. With a massive boom, the stones in the air were jolted away somewhat. The wind and snow suddenly sped up and the mountain path became even colder. With several crisp clangs, the weapons of many cultivators fell to the ground. Chen Chongqing realized that his right hand was not listening to him, as if it had truly been frozen stiff. He was actually unable to break the button in his palm. Relying on the endless supply of arrays in Mount Han, several hundred heaven stones once more fell. The middle-aged scholar raised his right hand and flicked a finger at the distant mountain path. An invisible and traceless chi passed through the encirclement of the heaven stones and arrived on the mountain path. Chen Chongqing's right hand had been locked down by the middle-aged scholar, but his left hand could still move. With an extremely faint sound of metal scraping against metal, the metal ball that had flown out of the sheath began to unfurl with unimaginable speed. An old umbrella appeared in Chen Chongqing's left hand. The yellow paper umbrella. A boom resounded through the mountain path. The stream water surged into the air and splashed into 10,000 snowflakes. The chi struck the surface of the yellow paper umbrella. An unimaginable and berserk energy traveled along the yellow paper umbrella's ribs and into Chen Chongqing's body. Chen Chongqing was like a pebble struck by a hammer. He howled through the air and fiercely smashed against the hard cliff. Dust rose and then gradually settled. A clear humanoid mark appeared on the cliff, as well as a pile of stone fragments, but Chen Chongqing was already nowhere to be seen. The reason Chen Chongqing was able to escape the middle-aged scholar's chi lock and disappear in such an unimaginable manner was naturally because he had been holding that button in his palm this entire time. It was no ordinary button, it was the button of Thousand Li. Back in the Orthodox Academy, when Luoluo encountered that demon assassin, she had used the button of Thousand Li, but it had been blocked by the heavenly net. The heavenly net was the demon lord's weapon. Although its power was no longer what it once was, it just so happened to be able to suppress the button of Thousand Li. Right now, the heaven's net should be in the hands of the great Zhou dynasty. Today, in Mount Han, Chen Chongqing encountered the master of the heaven's net and used the Thousand Li button to escape. He was not blocked by the heaven's net, but was blocked by a large rock. He should have already left the perimeter of Mount Han and rendezvoused with Mao Qiu and Linghai Jiwang at the base of the mountain, but he was still in the mountains. The several thousand rocks floating in the sky sealed off all of Mount Han, so he could not leave. It was a boulder the size of a small hill, right in front of the mountain path. Chen Chongqing's face was extremely pale. His internal injuries erupted and he spat out a mouthful of blood onto the stone. The middle-aged scholar's distant finger was actually faintly superior to Zhu Luo's sword that he had seen in Xuanyang City. If not for the yellow paper umbrella, he would definitely be dead. Even so, a tear appeared on the surface of the yellow paper umbrella. Chen Chongqing looked at the blood on the rock and confirmed that there was no smell, but he still could not relax. Grabbing a handful of dirt from the ground and covering it, he swiftly rushed up the mountain path. In his past battles, he very rarely fled, much less abandoned his companions. But today was different, because he had no chance of defeating the middle-aged scholar, or even slightly resisting him. Moreover, he was keenly aware that the middle-aged scholar's target was him, so the further he fled, the safer his companions would be. So he fled with abnormally firm resolve. He used the blazing sword, ignited his true essence as if his life depended on it, and madly rushed up Mount Han with unimaginable speed. In the mountains shrouded in darkness, a dragon of dust appeared and instantly traveled several li. The stream bank and the mountain path were all quiet. The crowd looked at the cliff where the dust had settled, at the marks left behind by the collision, and they were all very shocked. Tang 36 and Zhishio did not look, only stared at the middle-aged scholar by the stream bank. Even though their faces were pale, their hearts were filled with fear, and they knew that they would die in the next moment, they still stared. The middle-aged scholar came to life and walked up the stream. The heavenstone array of Mount Han reacted, and several hundred heavenstones surrounded him. Zhishio and Tang 36 also moved at the same time, lunging at the middle-aged scholar. They naturally knew that they were no match for the middle-aged scholar, but he was clearly coming for Chen Chongqing. At this moment, he was assuredly pursuing Chen Chongqing, so every moment they could delay was a moment. They had not been able to delay the middle-aged scholar, but they had not died. Far from Xuelao City and in the human world, the middle-aged scholar's time was very precious, at least more precious than their lives, so he ignored them. Zhixio and Tang 36 were simply incapable of catching up to the middle-aged scholar's footstep. The middle-aged scholar seemed to be walking very slowly, but he instantly appeared on the distant mountain. Most frightening of all was that he was actually carrying those several hundred heaven stones with him as he walked. Those heaven stones possessed an unimaginable weight. At this moment they were all on the scholar's body, yet they could not slow him down for even a moment. Heavy booms came from the mountains like thunder. Countless cliffs collapsed and the mountain path snapped. This sight was very strange, very shocking, very frightening, very powerful. With the departure of the middle-aged scholar and those heaven stones, the snowstorm and pressure by the stream and the mountain path instantly vanished. With a boom, the stream water was jolted off the ground, shot several hundred zhang into the sky, and then fell back down like rain. The cliffs, the mountain path, and the grass fiercely shook, groans incessantly echoing through the air. Those yellow lantern-like persimmons in the forest dropped to the ground. Whether they were ripe or unripe, they were all smashed into a pulp, just like the corpses and flesh by the stream. That large rock was still quietly floating there, very close to the ground. It seemed like a small mountain. The middle-aged scholar was on the opposite cliff. He stretched out his hand and made a grabbing motion. The small mountain of rock flew over and landed in his hand. Compared to this small mountain of rock, he seemed very insignificant, almost completely obscured by it. A mountain had fallen into his hands. This sounded a little inappropriate, but it had really happened. A cold wind suddenly blew through the darkness of the cliff, blowing away the dust on the rock and revealing the bloodstains that had not yet completely dried. The middle-aged scholar lowered his head and sniffed at that place. His expression was still indifferent, but he slowly closed his eyes as if he was intoxicated. My son was indeed correct. The middle-aged scholar opened his eyes and looked at the bloodstains on the rock. He revealed a faint smile, appearing very satisfied. The mountains and rivers on his face seemed a little brighter, a little livelier. In the next moment, the mountains and rivers dimmed a little. Because he raised his brow. It was not completely ripe, but it should be enough. The hidden wounds left over from back then should be able to be completely healed. He could finally put down his heavy burden and continue advancing towards the ultimate realm of grand freedom. Thinking about this, thinking about these long years, even he could not help but feel somewhat emotional. The next chapter, 8 p.m.